Welcome to the Season 2 Part 1 Mushoku Tensei Supercut. From Sylphie's fated meeting with Ariel all the way to her reunion with Rudy, here's everything the anime left out in between all that. A 3+ hour long deep dive recounting every detail that you might be interested in. Let's get started. Episode 0 Part 1, The Princess of Asura and the Angel, covering the extra chapter from Volume 3 of the light novel. For those unaware of where we are, this is the Silver Palace of Asada, the largest, most beautiful castle in the world, located in the largest, most populous city in the world. What looked so elegant and refined on the outside, though, was actually home to this repulsive, never-ending struggle for power. Day in and day out, the nobles housed within would constantly plot against, deceive, and betray each other. It was a constant war in which absolutely no one could be trusted. One that would remain uninterrupted up until the events of the displacement incident. So, with Sylphie's arrival marking the beginning of a major shift in the way these wars were waged, it's this episode that begins the story of how all that was set in motion. Starting with Princess Ariel and her usual visit to the Royal Lily Garden. Now, there was a number of other flower-specific gardens from which she could choose from, but the palace's lilies were by far her favorite. So much so that she would come here every 3 days and drink tea with only her guardian knight and mage. The reason she was never accompanied by anyone else was because no one would dare approach her and her unparalleled beauty. You see, as a princess widely considered to be the most beautiful to have ever lived, to even consider doing such would likely be perceived as rude. So there wasn't a single person brave enough to try and drink tea with her here. It would only ever be herself and her 2 sworn defenders. As for who those 2 were, the first was her knight named Luke, whose identity is something that will likely be revealed at a later time. All you need to know now is that he's an intermediate rank in the sword god style, still in his early teens, and every woman in the castle can't resist being entranced by him. There isn't a single other man in the castle who's admired as much as he is. Moving on to Ariel's mage Derek, he was a bit older at around 16 years old, but was only a mid-level noble unlike his knightly counterpart. The reason he'd been assigned such a prestigious position was because noble magicians also capable of advanced magic were quite the rarity in just about any part of the world. He was a top graduate from the illustrious Asura Institute of Magic. Now, since no one was ever present to hear what these 3 would discuss, their topics of conversation were always a key interest around the castle. As for what they were talking about today, well, I'm sure it was just as important as it always is. A discussion pertaining to the nipples of a maid Luke had bedded the other day. So, if you didn't quite catch on to what they were discussing here, that was the entirety of their conversation. Luke was describing his encounters with the maid, and Ariel was impressed, suggesting she'd take that same maid into her own bed one day. Something you may not have picked up on instead, though, was the fact that both Ariel and Luke were quite the lustful individuals. In fact, most, if not all, Asura nobility were like this. Since the Asuran kingdom had never experienced war or famine within its entire 400-year history, a large majority of nobility took part in this scandalous behavior. As for Ariel and Luke in particular, both had a habit of preying on the palace's maids and the daughters of mid-rank nobles. For Luke, this was rather common knowledge, but for Ariel, not many were aware that she was both bisexual and a sadist. That being the case, the life she lived was a carefree one filled with pleasure. She couldn't care less for the devious plotting taking place within the castle, but instead basked in a more refined simplicity. It was a core aspect of Asura as a whole, since the nation was known for their indulgence in the more decadent things. So much so that their refined taste had actually become this elite kind of status symbol for them. Now, a very important thing to note about Ariel is that while she is 4th in line to the succession of the throne, as the only true daughter of the queen consort, she's actually the one and only fully legitimate heir to the throne. The rest are half-siblings born from mothers that aren't the true queen consort. This isn't something widely discussed, because if that news was to ever reach someone like Gravel, then it would only be a matter of time until assassins would come for her. I mean, it was already bad enough that nobles were constantly swearing fealty to her. It's not like they knew that she was the true heir, but their own self-interests painted the image that she was vying for the throne herself. Which, as we know, she wasn't. So, Ariel simply preferred to live her life the way that she wanted. To even consider participating in this power struggle was just absolutely absurd to her. It didn't really matter how high up she was in the succession ladder because to her there was no way she'd ever stand a chance against her brothers. She was just too young and had too few allies. Thus the reason she instead chooses to indulge herself in the simple pleasures. Now, they didn't really show this in the anime, but the reason Derek so vehemently fought against that idea was because he truly believed Ariel could bring positive change to the kingdom. It's not that the first or second prince were unworthy successors to the throne, but it's just that their position as king would be simply ordinary. Sure, they'd become respectable rulers like all the others before them, but their standard approach to ruling would mean that nothing would change. The Asuran kingdom would continue with that constant power struggle like it always has. Nobles would continue to plot against each other without consequence, and all that time, energy, and money spent doing so would be wasted instead of actually being put towards something useful. Asuda wouldn't march towards progress like all the other nations surrounding them, and there was no doubt that that would eventually lead to them becoming vulnerable to foreign influence. If you're wondering why no one has tried to warn against this, well, that's because no one has really seen the need to. You see, in the 400 years of the Asuran kingdom's history, not once have the people living within ever gone hungry. There was never a time when the people had become so discontent that they felt the need to rise up and change anything. So, with nothing out there to challenge the status quo, the nobility saw zero need for anything to change. Instead, they spent all their time focusing solely on the progression of their own status, resulting in the kingdom itself becoming stagnant. Now, there was still progress being made in the fields of magic and technology, but that progress was nowhere near close to that which was being made by their neighbors. The King Dragon Realm just south had already overtaken them in technological development, and the Magic Nation's research in the arcane was accelerating far faster than their own. So, even if the Asura Kingdom still had overwhelming advantages in other areas right now, there was no telling where their position would be in a century or so. I mean, even now, the King Dragon Realm was already looking for any weaknesses so they could claim the Asuran Kingdom's land as their own. The nobles believed the mountains lining its border made invasion practically impossible, but if technology made something like that negligible, then it really was only a matter of time until some foreign power tried to intrude on their own. That being the case, Derek believed Ariel to be the only person capable of changing Asura for the better. The way he perceived her intelligence and wit outshone all the others he'd ever come across before. It was actually the very reason he applied for this position in the first place. He felt she could become a ruler like Goddess Freyan, the woman who'd led humankind during the latter stages of the Laplace War. As a ruler beloved by pretty much everyone, Derek truly believed Ariel could do the same. I mean, she already had quite a few people willing to lay down their lives for her. So really it was just a matter of making herself more influential. Now, as Derek continued to ponder the best path to make Ariel queen, he had actually stepped out to go to the bathroom. And it was while there that he just so happened to overhear two individuals scheming against Ariel. He didn't know who it was that was talking, but they did mention how Gravel viewed her as a threat. Something about her popularity with the common folk being greater than his own. That fact was a little strange considering her lack of interest in politics as a whole, but they couldn't rule out that she could be laying the groundwork for something bigger. Really, it was all just due to Ariel's natural charisma. It wasn't her intention to become this public icon, but because she liked to show face at numerous external functions, it was only natural the people become infatuated with her. So, seeing as how it was best to solve this problem sooner than later, the two shady individuals decided they should make the arrangements now, leading Derek to want to storm out and kill these men immediately. But with no basis on why he was doing so, to the rest of the nobles it would just look like Ariel taking action against her brother, an open act of hostility that would surely lead to their demise. That being the case, Derek felt it best to go back and simply warn the princess. Since her brother was already planning to force her into this, the only option she had left was to face it head on. At least that way they could plan more accordingly together. So, as he hurried back to the garden, Derek's mind contemplated on whether he'd be able to protect the princess or not. Sure, he'd said multiple times he'd lay down his life for her, but when it truly came down to a life-or-death struggle, he wondered whether he'd actually be able to do it or not. Well, as it would turn out, Derek would have to wonder no longer, as the displacement incident would place a Terminator boar right in the garden where Ariel was sitting. Since both her and Luke were occupied in conversation though, neither had noticed this D-rank monster appear behind them. Only Derek saw it as he emerged back to the gardens from the lavatory. At first, he believed this to be the work of the nobles he'd just overheard, but no nobleman was capable of smuggling such an enormous beast here, especially not to the heart of the palace like this. Regardless of what little sense it made though, the only thing that mattered now was ensuring Ariel's safety, a task we saw cost his life. His initial shout did alert the princess that the boar was coming, but the only thing he could do after was place himself between her and the monster, leading to the fatal blow that would shatter his ribs and crush his organs. Then, right after having his spine shattered on the wall 5 meters away, that's when Derek knew that he was dying. He would look around to see if Ariel was safe, but he was surprised to see that she was actually running towards him. She had disregarded everything else and went straight to hold the guardian mage that just protected her. So, as she held the dying Derek in her arms, his final words were to take the throne and make Asada into a better country, all while praying to Saint Millis in hopes that some miracle would keep the princess alive. He didn't expect his prayers to work, but when they were actually answered by the angel who'd fallen from the sky, Derek's heart filled with peace knowing that Ariel was safe now. He knew there was still hope for the country that only Ariel could save. So, with the Fatoa incident costing this young mage his life, in return it provided Ariel with a new and different purpose. Perhaps she really could make the change that Derek envisioned. Perhaps she could strengthen Asada to the point it could conquer the entire continent. If there was any person who could achieve it, it was the princess that this guardian mage had just died for, bringing us to the end of this turning point for Ariel. Episode 0, Part 2, Guardian Fits, covering the extra chapter from Volume 4 of the light novel. A key difference that simply wasn't able to be adapted from the novels was the entire mystery surrounding the character of Fitz. You see, unlike how we can clearly see it's Sylphie in the anime, the novels never once made it explicitly clear that Fitz was her. Sure, there were plenty of hints that implied that it was likely her, but with Fitz constantly being referred to as he/him and the only tell being her skilled teacher in silent casting, you were never really certain Fitz was her until later on in the story. So, since that mystery is no longer there, I'll simply refer to Fitz as Sylphie now. Starting with when she was falling, I'm sure the number one question you have is why her hair turned white. Well, similar to how it is in Fate, it was the result of using up all her mana. By succumbing to the fear of the imminent death in front of her, Sylphie unleashed all her mana in a flurry of spells to try and break her fall. She remembered how Rudy mentioned how flying was impossible, but in the attempts where he did try to make it happen, he always put something soft on the ground to fall on. So, taking that lesson into consideration, Sylphie would try every element in hopes of wrapping herself up in something soft. Unfortunately for her though, the water wouldn't stick, the wind couldn't provide nearly as much resistance, her earth magic she didn't even know how to control, and the fire would just immediately dissipate. It was a nightmare Sylphie would constantly relive even after surviving by just barely slowing herself down enough. Contrary to what we were shown, however, Sylphie didn't really come out unscathed from it. You see, in addition to her hair turning white from the exhaustive use of mana beyond her limits, she had also broken both her legs in the landing. It wasn't quite the graceful tumble we saw in the anime. Now, where this chapter begins in the novels is right after Sylphie awakens from that exact nightmare. She was already the guardian mage of the princess, and her nightmare had just caused her to wet her bed right in front of Luke. Of course, she was extremely embarrassed, but with Luke knowing the circumstances of her arrival, he was much more considerate than how he normally would be if dealing with a man. In any case, that was much less important when compared to how extraordinary of a teacher she was. As a 10-year-old capable of at least intermediate magic in every school, she was quite the prodigy even amongst the other royal mages, especially since she was capable of that silent casting. So, with that catching the eye of the princess, she was taken in as her new guardian mage and equipped with several items that would allow her to do her job better. There were the magical boots of swiftness that let her run twice as fast, a flame-trapping cloak that kept her body temperature constant, gloves of overpowering which halved any impact on the hands, then the sunglasses which surprisingly weren't just to hide her identity. While many of the nobles did see them as disrespectful, they were actually magical items deemed necessary by the king himself. They were a useful tool capable of notifying Sylphie whenever Ariel was in trouble, one that became required after the incident in the garden. So, no matter how far away Sylphie was from Ariel, so long as she was wearing those glasses, Sylphie would always know if Ariel was in trouble. Now, one of the major clues that gave away Fitz's identity was the peculiar behavior Luke seemed to have while around him. You see, because he would always say how he loved women and hated men, it was rather odd to see him be so kind to a boy like Fitz. To us, we know that's more of a hint that Fitz was actually a girl, but to the nobles who suspected nothing, it was more likely that Luke had started taking an interest in men now. They began to think that perhaps he had finally come to understand the beauty of them. The reason why this is because homosexuality was just as common as being straight. In the Asuran capital, there existed far stranger sexual preferences than that between two men or two women. So, as the nobles talking came to that conclusion about Luke, they also pondered the origins of Fitz. None knew where it was that he came from, but there was one who did have some sort of inkling. It was quite a few years ago, but back when a certain Boreas princess was having her 10th birthday, there was a particular person who just so happened to stand out there. It wasn't Eris and her less than elegant behavior, but instead the teacher who transformed that monkey princess into a ladylike noble. Back when this noble had met Eris before, she was only ever known for neglecting her studies and beating up her classmates, thus the reason for her nickname as the Monkey Princess. But when this noble returned for her 10th birthday, Eris didn't behave like a monkey at all. Apparently she'd been trained by a mentor 2 years younger. Lord Sados didn't specify who that mentor was, but the way he spoke so highly of him made it seem like it could be the same person Ariel recruited as her new guardian. I mean, this Fitz person did possess much of the same skill after all. Not only was she well versed in reading, writing, and arithmetic, but she was supposedly more knowledgeable in magic than even the university professors and was said to regularly beat the knights in training in combat. There also weren't many other 10-year-olds who could just cast magic without saying anything. So, with that being the only knowledge these nobles had to go on, it was rather fair to make the assumption that Fitz might have been Rudy. Regardless of who Fitz was though, nothing changed the fact that he was still a lowborn. And when it came to a peasant being among nobility, there was no lack of criticism to be had from the nobles who looked down on him, much to the point that they just wanted to peel back Fitz's mask and see who was underneath. Now, switching over to Ariel's scheming, the noble she was scheming with was none other than Pilamon Noto's Grey Rat, the liege lord of Asuda's Milbots region. As for what they were planning together, well, since the main issue was Ariel's lack of influence, the best path to gain some was through the low-end mid-rank nobles. Since all the powerful high-rank ones were already loyal to the first and second prince, it was very unlikely that they would suddenly switch to a much weaker candidate. So, at least by going for nobles much lower down on the ladder, Pilamon could tempt them with positions of higher power within the government. Then, by focusing on nobles more out in the countryside, she could reach a group of people less affiliated with the continent's political disputes. It was all part of a strategy that looked towards the future. Sure, she may not have power right now, but 10 years down the road when their plans come to fruition, those who supported Ariel would be the ones rewarded greatly. That was the promise that came when joining her faction. Another part of her strategy that was hinted at in the anime was Ariel's discreet gathering of the military support. To other nobles, the military may have been forgotten due to their lack of importance recently, but if a civil war was to ever break out, whoever controlled the military would always be the one to win. They were a prime asset whose lack of political influence often made them overlooked. So, while Ariel publicly displayed herself as this terrified princess frightened by the disputes of the political ladder, in secret she was gathering allies and preparing to enter the fray herself. She was doing exactly what her former guardian Derek would have wanted from her. An important aspect of her story that I covered last episode, which you should definitely go watch if you want to understand Princess Ariel better. Now, after Sylphie inquired into the status of her lost friends and family, it was here that Ariel would give us an update on the Boreas family. With the incident having removed both their land and all their people with it, any power the Boreas had before was open for the taking by those who opposed them. It took all they had for any of the Boreas remaining to just try and keep their positions of power. So, with that being their primary concern, there was very little being put towards looking for the missing residents. At least that was until the Boreas were taken under the protection of Darius, a high-ranking minister who supported the first prince. With him providing the assets and funding to create a proper search party, this group would grow in size and lead to a story of its own, something the novels only briefly alluded to. Switching over to Grabble's scheming now, we were given a bit more context as to why Ariel taking the military would be so bad for him. Its position as the strongest military in any nation was definitely desirable, but it was more so the fact that half the army itself was common folk. As I mentioned last episode, Ariel's popularity with the commoners was outrivaled by no one. So even with Grabble having numerous allies in the upper chain of command, if a few captains and commanders were to suddenly become loyal to Ariel, any soldiers below them would surely do so too. Consider it a perk of being so popular with the common folk. So, with that being the main thing Grabble was worried about, he would discuss precautions with Darius just like how we saw here. The only things being cut, a few vulgar moments censored in even the uncensored version. In the next scene with Sylphie and Ariel, there wasn't really much different with regards to the whole assassination attempt, but the final attack did sever every limb on the assassin's body. It seems getting hit by a direct attack from Sylphie is powerful enough to blow all your arms and legs off. Another excluded detail highlighting Sylphie's prowess is the fact that the poison would have killed her if not for her quick thinking. You see, even as she was in the process of blacking out, Sylphie had still managed to cast detoxification magic on herself. If this was any other mage incapable of silent casting, then without a doubt they would have died right there instantly. Fortunately, her use of detoxification combined with the minute amount of poison she was struck by allowed her enough time to live until the doctors got there. So, after having defeated a famed assassin who was active for over a decade, Sylphie's impressions with the nobles improved greatly. She was finally worthy of the position she was given, and her ability to dispatch enemies without saying a word had donned her the nickname Silent Fitz. Many more assassins would attempt to come for Ariel after this, but each and every one would be eliminated by Sylphie. No matter how many she slayed though, more and more would just keep coming. And whenever the Knights Guild would be sent to investigate, they would always be pressured to leave the cases unsolved. Someone clearly didn't want anyone else looking into this. So, with each and every assassination attempt adding to the mental burden on Ariel, the only option to alleviate it was to flee, resulting in her departure for the Magic Academy at the end of the episode and bringing us to the end of this cut content. Episode 1 doesn't hesitate to highlight Rudy's depression, but there are actually two very important aspects I feel aren't as fleshed out as they should be. The first is the whole plan Rudy concocted to find his mother, and the second is the extent to just how broken he really is inside. They're both elements that are definitely present, but nowhere near as prominent as they were in the novels. And it's that bit of cut content that helps to explain a lot of the choices that Rudy makes here. So, as we kick off another season of Mushoku Tensei, let's take a look at what the anime left out from the novels. Let's get started. Episode 25, The Broken-Hearted Magician, covering chapters 1 and 2 from volume 7 of the light novel. Where we currently find our depressed protagonist is a particular forest known to many as Worm's Whiskers, a dense woods that separated Asura's northern border from the valley known as the Redworm's Upperjaw. For those familiar with my cut content from last season, you'd recognize this as the northern counterpart to the path Rudius was on when he encountered Orsted. It was the only other route that provided relatively safe passage through the dragon-filled mountains surrounding the Asuran border. The journey from there had only been a few days so far, but from here to the duchy Rudy was heading to, there were at least another 2 months left by carriage. It was a lengthy journey of countless sighs and uncomfortable silence in which Rudy was the sole cause of. Before we talk about that crippling depression though, there was a bit of backstory given on the caravan itself, specifically the merchant who was running it. As a simple traveling merchant who was on the up and up, Bruno had been tasked with transporting 2 carriages of goods from Asura to the Northern Territories. It was a valuable shipment that, if lost, would likely mean the end of his career and his life. So, given that the journey was quite the dangerous one, it was only natural Bruno hire adventurers to help him protect it. I mean, the path itself was one that very few merchants would ever even risk traveling. There were just too many monsters inhabiting the forest. So much so that it was actually cheaper for Asura to build a giant wall instead of constantly pay adventurers to exterminate them. That being the case, there was a total of 8 people that accompanied him on this journey. 5 paid guards who were members of the B-ranked party Counter Arrow, 2 swordsmen in training that were seeking passage to the north, then 1 gloomy magician who was also in need of transportation. Those last 3 technically weren't guards like the adventurers, but if there did happen to be some sort of ambush, Bruno did expect them to help fight as well. It was their lives too that would be on the line after all. Now, just as how we saw in the anime, Rudy's depression was so apparent that you could practically hear exactly what he was thinking. He was the embodiment of an empty void whose mere presence sucked the life out of everything, thus the reason the carriage was so entirely lifeless. When Suzanne had tried to make conversation, while his responses were loud and filled with energy, his expressions were fully contradictory, all the way to the point where he just flat out refused to participate in the conversation. To some that may have been seen as rude, but to travelers who were on the road often, it was an unspoken rule to not get too nosy into other people's affairs. If a fellow traveler didn't want to talk, then that would be that and nothing more would be made of it. So, for Sarah to ignore this custom and pry even further, well, that was something that highlighted her inexperience and youth. It was our first look into this new character whose very personality resembled Eris. Now, when Rudy gave the reason for his behavior, everything began to make sense as this was a scenario that they were all too familiar with. You see, as a party that helped a lot with Fatoa's recovery effort, they'd seen Rudius's exact expression numerous times before. It was the face of someone who'd experienced crushing loss. It may not have been for the exact reason they were thinking of, but the melancholy was all the same regardless, leading Suzanne to pry even further. It was clear she felt pity for the boy in front of her and, as such, asked more questions despite knowing how annoyed it would make Rudius feel. So, seeing as how Suzanne wasn't going to stop, Rudy led on this superficial conversation just to appease her. He wasn't really paying attention to it, but she did say some things that were worth acknowledging. Like, the reason her and her party were heading north was mainly due to the lack of jobs fitting their skill in the Asura region. Since the monsters there were much weaker than the monsters here, their plan was to move north and re-establish themselves in the Magic Nations. Sure, the competition may be tougher what with all the veteran adventurers and warriors in training, but with such a high density of monsters being present, there were more than enough jobs to go around for all of them. It was just mere coincidence that Rudy happened to be on the same journey as them. This wasn't a location he chose for any particular reason, but was instead somewhere that just wasn't Fatoa. It honestly could have been anywhere. So, where he ended up at the end of this 2-month journey was the city of Rosenberg in the Duchy of Bashadant, a place commonly referred to as the gateway to the Northern Territories. As the core location from which magical tools were exported, the revenue made here made up more than half of the entire country's. Now, the first thing Rudy did once here was find an inn where he wouldn't freeze to death. You see, something Suzanne had mentioned which he actually picked up on was that any inn meant for the C or D ranked didn't come with heating. So, if you didn't want to sleep in a room the same temperature as outside, then it was best to stay at an inn for the B ranked or higher. It was a place definitely more expensive than many of the others, but for Rudy that really wasn't much of an issue. Because both Eris and Ruijerd left without taking any share of the money they'd earned, Rudy had pretty much all the money Dead End made during their entire time adventuring, not to mention a little bit extra from when he'd helped Alphonse at the refugee camp. So that's why he seems to have so much money here. It was after he'd settled in that every moment was spent actively avoiding any and all thoughts of Eris. He would look outside, admire the scenery, take in the nature, and even acknowledge Basharant's infrastructure. But the moment any of those thoughts stagnated, he would immediately focus on Eris again. Her name would just subconsciously slip out of his mouth on its own, leading to a downward spiral of emotion the anime unfortunately doesn't portray very well. I'm sure we're all well aware of just how much a shock Eris's departure was for Rudy, but when you find out the way that he himself perceives it, well, that just adds a whole nother layer of depression to the mix. I mean, he was so convinced that the two of them loved each other that he was already planning the future they would share together. He assumed he'd support her now that she'd lost her parents, commit to her for every day of the rest of their lives, then live that life together somewhere in Asada. Sure, there may have been a few obstacles given their noble bloodlines, but Rudy was so determined to protect her and give his all that no amount of people opposing them would prevent them from being together. He was ready to stand against any enemy and even run away if need be. Now, Rudy thought Eris may have felt the same way, but after her sudden departure and cryptic note, his only thoughts were of just how mistaken he was. To him, he felt he didn't mean anything to her. To him, she was just completely done with him. His self-esteem was right back to where it was before he reincarnated. So, whenever Rudy's mind went to the love he thought he shared, the only reassurance he could give himself was the fact that he was lucky to have been given such happiness at all. It didn't matter how brief of a moment it was, because for a person like him, to expect someone to fall in love with him was just ridiculous. He truly believed that such a feat was flat out impossible now. When Rudy was finally able to move on from that, his next thoughts were of how he was going to search for Zenith. A rather important topic considering it is the reason he supposedly left Asura for. It's also the core motivation for a lot of the decisions he makes later on in the episode. I don't know why they decided not to include it, but we can pretty much sum it up all like this. Zenith's been missing for more than a couple years now, so it was extremely unlikely she was anywhere easily discoverable. She definitely wasn't going to be found in a major city like this, but with such a massive population to gather information from, they were definitely the best places to find clues in. That said, at the end of the day, Rudy was just a single boy. No matter how thorough he was, he'd never be able to search the city in its entirety, let alone the entire world. So, rather than search for a single left-handed person in a crowd of 10,000, Rudy got the idea of getting the crowd to work for him. What if he told that crowd the person he was looking for? Eventually that information would spread to everyone and that single left-handed person might just step forward themselves. As for how he was going to do that, well, the easiest way was to make himself famous. If he could somehow forge this identity as a prominent adventurer, then it likely wouldn't be long until his story would pass between other guilds. All he had to do was pull off a few impressive feats then share who he was, after which it was just a matter of dealing with leads and sifting through information. Now, as good of a plan as this was, Rudy didn't have much faith he'd have any luck with it. Not only had it already been several years since Zenith had gone missing, but with a massive organization like the Search and Rescue Squad trying and failing to find her too, what luck would Rudy and his significantly less resources have? It was a despair-filled thought that made him wonder if it was all just a big waste of time. With zero alternatives and a promise he made to his dad though, the only option was to try anyway. It was better than just sitting around doing nothing. Fast forward to the next day, and while normally Rudy wouldn't care what people in the Adventurers Guild were saying about him, today every unkind word stung more than the last. It seems he was a lot more susceptible to people's opinions on him. When he went to the front desk to disband his party next, a major difference I'm surprised they didn't include was the sudden breakdown Rudy had while doing so. You see, rather than the pensive stare we got in the anime, there was a whole waterfall of tears that came from knowing that Dead End was, well, dead. It's not like he had intended to cry here, but the emotional attachment he had to such a defining part of his life was something I suppose he just wasn't willing to part with yet. It was the moment he had come to realize that he was truly alone. A painful fact he wasn't ready to be confronted with yet. I don't know why they didn't decide to show this, but without a vulnerable moment like that, I feel Rudy's emotional distress isn't made as apparent. There were numerous times where he should have been close to tears just from the mention of Eris or Ruijerd, but many of those moments were replaced with a more stoic Rudius. So you'll just have to believe me when I say Rudius truly was a broken mess right now. After the tears were settled and a job was chosen, we find out that the pain stifling his chest was a type of trauma stemming from a very specific mindset. Whenever he felt it didn't matter if he lived or died, it was that blatant disregard for life which would cause it. A defeatist mentality that contradicted everything he vowed to do better this time. His holy relic didn't really do much to diminish the pain itself, but holding on to it did make him feel better. And if you just so happen to want one of these holy relics yourself, then you can actually get the card version from my streams every Sunday. It's just a little promo for my Twitch where I talk about Mushoku Tensei live, then open up some card packs for it. Now, remember when I said finding Zenith was the core motivation for a lot of Rudy's decisions? Well, deciding to party up with Suzanne here was actually one of them. If he was gonna make a name for himself and spread his story, then the best way to do that was to get to know other adventurers. Sure, he could do the most amazing things solo, but if no one was around to see them happen, then at best the story that would spread would just be these vague rumors. Mainly because adventurers weren't very interested in other adventurers. Especially not some kid they didn't care about. So, the best way Rudy figured he could spread his story was by joining as many parties as possible. With enough work and enough time, surely his name and story would eventually spread to other guilds. He just needed to find a party willing to take him. Of course, just like we saw in the anime, it was none other than Suzanne and her misplaced sympathy that would make that job extremely easy for him this time. She had just watched Rudy bawl his eyes out and as a result felt enough pity to invite him to the party, leading to their joint handling of that A-rank job involving the Luster Grizzlies. With this formally introducing the members of Counter Arrow, we were given a bit more context as to each person's position and what they were capable of. There's not much more to be said about Suzanne or Timothy, but for Mimir he was the intermediate rank in healing magic, then beginner in detoxification. Patrice had additional skills as a mage, but with the only spells he knew being beginner rank wind ones, he was much more useful with his sword than the small beginner's wand he also carried. Then last but certainly not least was the most talented out of all of them, Sarah. Sure, the other members were all B-ranked veterans, but Sarah's sheer talent placed her at a level above in the A rank. Her skill with the bow was just absolutely unparalleled. Combine that with acute battlefield awareness and an unprecedented level of agility, and what you get is a prodigy whose raw talent was comparable to Eris. Seriously, that was a direct quote from Rudius himself. What makes Sarah even more exceptional though is that in a world where mages have greater range and do more damage, it takes a truly special talent to make those disadvantages seem irrelevant. Like, mages could just take a nap and recover their mana, while an archer was limited by the amount of arrows they were carrying. Their attacks could only ever hit one target at a time, and an immaculate level of precision was needed to ensure that they actually hit every time. So, unless you were someone like Hawkeye or Legolas, you were typically better off learning magic instead of archery. That's not to say an archer was less effective than a mage though, because if that archer was capable of firing 5 arrows before a mage could cast one single spell, or even land a critical hit with every one of their shots, then being an archer was completely fine. It was just extremely hard to become that skilled at it, thus the reason archers weren't particularly common in this world. All in all, as a group, Counter Arrow's raw combat strength was probably somewhere in the upper C ranks. When taking into account their coordination and cohesiveness as a unit, that's what brought them up into the B ranks. Individually, they weren't really anything special, but altogether their methodical approach to adventuring was amazing. That was the conclusion Rudy had come to. So, given that there wasn't much room for an outsider to intervene, out of the 3 days they spent traveling to find the Grizzlies, the only support Rudy was ever needed for was the casting of Quagmire. Whenever enemies were spotted in the distance, his only role was to turn the floor around them to mud. That way any enemies that might gank from the flank would be slowed by a boggy terrain from which traversal was difficult. It was a nod to Counter Arrow's systematic teamwork, but at the same time it also didn't allow Rudy to show what he was and wasn't capable of. Now, when the group realized they were surrounded by a pack of 60 bears wearing camouflage, everyone understood just how grim the situation was, but none except for Rudy accepted the probable death awaiting them. Sure, they were trembling in fear at the sight of 60 wild beasts wanting to rip them to shreds, but their determination to survive far outweighed those feelings of terror. No amount of dread was gonna make them give up, and it was that very resolve that started to resonate with Rudy. He wasn't frozen because of the imminent death that was coming for him, but was instead awestruck by the unshakable will of Counter Arrow. They were emotions that at first he didn't know how to process, but as soon as he saw the lack of despair on all their faces, he finally remembered that there were still plenty of things worth living for. He understood that it really did matter if he died. Yes, he may have lost something very important to him, but that didn't mean that he had lost everything. And it was that realization that there were still things worth living for that renewed Rudy's motivation to keep pushing forward, leading him to cast the spell Exodus Flame. So, in this moment where Rudy was just about to give up, it was an image of Roxy that had come and saved him. As the strongest and most determined person he knew, he could only imagine that she too would fight just like all the others were. This wasn't a trait that she was just naturally born with, but was instead something she'd learned through her life as an adventurer. And it was that teaching of what it meant to be alive that helped Rudy realize that maybe things weren't so bad. As an orphan born to a simple hunter and his common folk wife, the only thing Sarah received from them was her name. Her first name. Since neither were of noble birth, they weren't so fortunate as to be able to offer anything more. Especially not a last name, since those were most often a privilege only nobility possessed. That didn't really matter though, since for the first 10 years of her life, Sarah was happy. In a small village right at the heart of Asura, close to the western edge of the Millbots region, Sarah had grown up helping her parents. It was one fateful day when she was 10 years old, though, that a massive horde of monsters would attack and take them away from her. They had lost their lives to an issue the liege lord of her region should have handled. But rather than that lord send his knights and assist immediately, it was instead parties of adventurers that would show up a whole lot later. One of which consisted of Suzanne and Timothy, and another with Mimir and Patrice. They weren't at all acquainted at the time, but when the battle was done and dead accounted for, each pair were the only two members remaining from their respective parties. It was a hard-fought clash in which those who survived joined to create their own party together, resulting in the formation of Counter Arrow. Now, back then they were only a D-rank party, but with Sarah's help and the constant in and out of other members, it was only a matter of time until they reached the B rank, after which we know there weren't too many quests remaining for them, at least not here in the Asura region. So, with no choice but to go somewhere else, the party decided that heading up north was best, bringing us to Sarah's fateful meeting with that depressed magician. When she first heard that he was a Grey Rat, her initial thoughts went straight to the noble who'd ruled over her village, the Notos Grey Rat that controlled the entirety of the Millbots region, yet failed to protect its people when they needed him most. So, without Rudy having even done anything yet, right from the get-go his name was associated with the very person who'd caused the death of her parents. His face even resembled that of the crafty-looking noble who'd once come to visit almost a decade ago. That said, it wasn't only the fact he was a Grey Rat that made her dislike him, since the last name itself was actually quite common. No, it was more so the fact that he even possessed a last name. Since that was a clear indication of noble upbringing, to her this Rudius Grey Rat was obviously a rich kid. He was this stuck-up noble who'd gotten fed up with his life of riches, then decided to leave it all in hopes of playing the adventurer. His robe and messy hair may have been an attempt to hide that, but the expensive staff he carried dictated otherwise. Not to mention his gloomy look, which practically screamed "I'm running away." It was a common occurrence that Sarah was all too familiar with, one she truly despised all the way down to her very core. She couldn't understand what it was that compelled these kids to want to leave behind their easy ride through life, but it was their half-hearted intent to follow through on doing so that made a mockery out of the very profession of adventuring. I mean, these kids would glorify fighting monsters and exploring labyrinths, but as soon as they were faced with any real danger, more times than not they would always run. They would never truly fight like their life depended on it, because at the end of the day they always had somewhere comfy to go back home to. It was this selfish approach to adventuring that always put the real adventurers in danger. There did exist the few whose talent allowed them to become adventurers for real, but out of the many years Sarah's been adventuring for, she'd never come across anyone who'd stuck with it. At most, they'd only ever do a couple jobs. So, it was that disregard for those who had no choice but to adventure, and their ideology that it was all just a game, that made Sarah hate those kids who treated it as such. She hated the idea of them dragging real adventurers into situations where they could potentially lose their livelihood. She hated how it was always just this brief experiment for them. So, as she pegged Rudy to be another one of those kids, her already shallow opinion of him went even lower. So much so that when Rudy stated he was looking for his mother, she immediately believed it to be a lie. To her, she felt he was just trying to seem special. That being the case, when it came time for Rudy to join their party, Sarah felt it best to keep his involvement to a minimum. Mainly because if there ever came a time when things looked dire, Sarah was certain Rudy would run just like all the other half-hearted adventurers. It was when that time never came with the Lester Grizzlies, though, that Sarah started to think that perhaps she underestimated him. She definitely still hated him because he was an aristocrat, but perhaps her initial opinion on him may have been a little bit harsh. Publicly, she still believed Rudy was lying about his mother, but deep down she knew everything he said was true. Her first job with him made her certain of it. She didn't like the fact that he'd kept his true powers hidden, but the truth of the matter was that Rudius had saved them. So, no matter how much she still wanted to call Rudy a fraud, deep in her heart she was fully aware that he wasn't. There was just something about him that she still couldn't tolerate, though. And it was way too humiliating to accept that one of those rich kids she hated had saved her. It was all incredibly frustrating, but the way Sarah lived with it was by downplaying the severity of it all. She told herself that because the challenge wasn't that hard for him, the next time he really was in danger, that's when she'd see him run. She was certain that Rudy was still the character she was making him out to be. Fast forward to after their encounter with the snowdrakes, and once again Rudy had proved her wrong. Combine that with the introduction of a person she hated even more than Rudius, and her impressions of this supposed rich kid had slightly improved a bit. You see, it was after Soldat had insulted both Timothy and Rudy that Sarah was furious because of just how wrong he was. She was surprised to find that she was taking Rudy's side for once. For a kid she thought she was supposed to hate, it came as quite the shock when she found herself thinking about just how bravely he fought for them. It made her think that perhaps she didn't hate him. Of course, that made zero sense at all to her, so Sarah believed it was just because she must have hated Soldat more. Since Soldat was clearly the worst of two evils, it was only natural she'd take the side of the lesser. I mean, there was a whole list of things Sarah came up with that made Rudy better than him. Such a list didn't seem right considering Rudy was born a noble, but out of the months she'd spent getting acquainted with him, Rudy certainly didn't act like one. It was extremely confusing since she'd convinced herself that she was supposed to hate them. They were, after all, the very reason her parents died, and she wasn't just about to forget the overwhelming despair of all that. But unlike the Grey Rat Noble whose duty it was to protect her back then, the Grey Rat Noble here actually protected her now, all without any duty whatsoever. He wasn't even a member of her party. But not only did he not run away when the situation looked tough, he even stayed behind to ensure everyone else was safe. It was an act of bravery that truly resonated with Sarah. So much so that when she looked back to find Rudy fighting on his own, she was the first to run back and try and save him. This was yet another shock to Sarah, since if she did actually hate him the way that she thought she was supposed to, then she would have had no problem leaving him behind back there. There was a clear shift in her perception that was taking place now. No matter how much she knew she loathed nobility, she just couldn't find herself hating Rudy anymore. And it was her inability to comprehend such a massive change in her core beliefs that once again made her so incredibly frustrated. The way she chose to justify it this time was by saying that she only disliked Rudy now. So while she no longer hates him the way that she thought she did, she definitely didn't like him. A crucial distinction she needed to make in order to help her sleep at night. Fast forward once more to after she was rescued, and that would be the trigger for the two to become a whole lot closer now. The two would share stories from their childhood, and Sarah would finally explain why she'd been so cold to him for the first 6 months. Yes, the Grey Rats were the ones responsible for the death of her parents, but Rudius definitely wasn't one of those Grey Rats. Through hard work and numerous acts of bravery, Rudius had circumvented her belief that even the children of nobles would grow up to commit the same crimes as their parents. She definitely still hated nobility in general, but Rudy was an exception she'd become quite fond of now. So what started off as a rich kid she couldn't even stand the sight of, turned into a person that wasn't so bad after the first job, then a respectable adventurer after the second. It was from there that her feelings began to change, and with it the core beliefs that every noble was evil. It didn't matter how much she would try to deny it, because nothing would stop her from realizing that Rudius was different. And it was after that whole endeavor with the Treant, along with the very fact he'd saved her life, that Sarah would finally realize it wasn't hatred at all in her heart. No, the feelings that made her so frustrated night after night was in fact a genuine affection to a person she'd fallen for. As soon as she'd come to that realization, Sarah didn't hesitate to go out and act on it. She began to invite him to more and more outings and took those as opportunities to get to know him better. Then the more and more they talked, the more she found her affection was growing for him, all the way to the point that she was ready to commit to him. The thing is, because she was too embarrassed to tell him her feelings directly, Sarah decided she would instead sleep with him first. She would use her life debt as a pretext to bed him, then go and tell him her feelings after. When that time came and Rudy's lack of arousal became apparent though, the whole thing was just a massive slap in the face for her. She was in complete and utter shock by the fact his body wasn't attracted to hers. Had she watched Rudy's reactions a bit more closely though, then she would have easily noticed that he was in just as much shock as she was. But because this was her first time and she was anxious too, it took all she had to salvage her pride then just get out of there, after which she would spend the entire night crying. Now, this next part is spoilers for what's to come in episode 4, but for the sake of finishing Sarah's story to completion, we're just gonna go ahead and talk about it now. So, if you don't want to know what happened after Sarah slapped Rudius, then feel free to click off the video now. It was the day after the whole debacle in bed that Sarah would compose herself and seek out Rudy. She'd heard he'd wandered off with Soldat, which was a more than worrying situation since the two weren't exactly friends or anything. When she found them you-know-where talking about you-know-what, every ounce of affection she still felt for him instantly turned to loathing. She was so overcome by shock and devastation that she was blinded to any clue which suggested this wasn't what she thought it was. Had she been a bit older and a bit more mature, then maybe she would have been able to see that something was off. But because Sarah was still this 16-year-old girl, everything she saw in the moment she treated as fact. To her, Rudy had spent the night with Soldat, sleeping with women that wasn't her, drinking the same alcohol he refused to drink with Counter Arrow, then recounting just how revolting Sarah's body was to him. That was the story Sarah came up with, and it was the story she would stick with until convinced otherwise. It wasn't until some time later that Suzanne would go ahead and share her own impressions of the situation. To her, something was very clearly off about Rudy. She wasn't sure what it was, but the boy she saw back there definitely wasn't the Rudius that she knew. So, knowing the dangers of coming to assumptions too quickly, Suzanne spoke from experience when she suggested it may just be a misunderstanding. Of course, Sarah was convinced Rudy had just been lying the past 6 months, but after Timothy suggested it was a misunderstanding too, Sarah finally resolved herself to determining the truth. She would return to town, question Rudy, then apologize if she did in fact jump to conclusions. When she returned and found he'd left, the only person she could talk to instead was Elise. A conversation that started out a bit hostile, but not from the person that you would expect. Since Elise knew the full context of the situation, she had recounted Rudy's story all while placing the entire blame on Sarah. It was important she understand exactly the type of corner she had backed Rudy into. So, once all was said and done, Elise had left Sarah with something to think about. If she wasn't even able to realize how much she'd hurt him, then she definitely wasn't ready to be his partner. It was a statement that weighed heavy on her even after. Reason being that, in addition to the pain Rudy had caused her earlier, she now had to bear the weight of the pain that she caused him. They were feelings of remorse and regret that would haunt her the entire night. Suzanne did suggest that they should go after him, but Sarah wasn't so brave as to be able to confront him like that. She was afraid that he wouldn't listen, scared he would push her away after what she'd done to him. So, after a long night sobbing and coming to terms with everything that had happened, Sarah simply accepted Rudy's silent departure as a sign of rejection. She knew now that the brief love they shared was over. If there did ever come a time where the two could meet again though, Sarah felt that she would like to apologize. A true and sincere one that would properly convey her feelings this time. Episode 27, Abrupt Approach, covering chapters 5 and 6 from volume 7 of the light novel. With the year having passed since Rudy had come to Rosenberg, not only was he well known by pretty much everyone, but his increased cooperation with Counter Arrow had made him significantly closer with them. After having saved Sarah all those months ago, it seemed like they were being a lot more deliberate in partying up with him. So much so that they would practically wait for him outside the Adventurers Guild. What started out as an occurrence that happened only once every 5 missions, slowly became 1 in 3, then 1 in 2, and now 4 in 5. For all intents and purposes, he was practically one of them now. That being the case, it was only natural he get closer with Sarah too, especially considering just how much more comfortable she was around him now. I'm not gonna go over her backstory again since the last video I did goes extremely in depth with that. Instead, we'll just go straight to their date. So, since Sarah wanted Suzanne to teach her how to use a sword, she first needed to replace her old one, a task she felt Rudy would have some insight in since he was after all an intermediate sword fighter. Of course, Rudy had no idea the difference between a good sword and a bad sword, but that didn't stop him from agreeing to go anyway. It was the first date he'd been on since that one time he went clothes shopping with Eris and Millis. When he reminisced on the outfits he saw then, it reminded him that he didn't really have anything date-worthy. The only pieces of clothing he'd ever wear was his robe and undershirt. So, with no time to buy anything and no sense on what was even fashionable, Rudy accepted the fact he would have to show up looking the same way he always did. That wasn't really that big of a deal though, since to him this wasn't really even a date anyway. Since he didn't want to go and get too ahead of himself, Rudy convinced himself that he was simply accompanying her. There was no way he would allow himself to think it was anything more. I mean, the very idea of Sarah being interested was just absurd to him. When she showed up looking the way that she did though, That's when Rudy thought that perhaps she actually was interested. Her hair was brushed, her outfit changed, and clear effort was put into being presentable. With Rudy's self-confidence still at an all-time low though, he still wasn't convinced Sarah liked him for, well, him. No, he was instead convinced she only liked him because he had saved her, chalking it up to some form or the other of crisis bonding. It's not like he'd tried to get himself on her route, but somehow he still ended up on it anyway. It was a pleasant surprise that also happened to stir all sorts of fear within him. He wasn't unhappy that a girl was interested in him, but his lack of reciprocal feelings made him unsure as how to react to all of it. So rather than jump straight in and overcommit, Rudy instead decided to go with the flow. He would tame his expectations and go about the day normally, thinking that getting too close too soon would only lead to disappointment. Now, the shop the two went to look for swords was a high-quality place known for their imports from the Asura Kingdom, a store that recently grew in popularity simply due to the sharp increase in the quality of their imports. If Rudy had to guess, it was likely the caravan he came up with was carrying goods for here. It was an expensive place with a limited selection, but the difference in quality you'd get was potentially life-saving. Even Rudy understood just how important a reliable secondary weapon was. An interesting thing to note about the shop itself is that while there were all sorts of weapons from staves to maces, there wasn't a single lance or spear here. Since those were the weapons associated with spurs, they were often considered the devil's weapons, and it was for that reason that both adventurers and merchants avoided them. When Sarah finally made her way back to the short swords, there were two options from which she couldn't choose from. A curved, balanced one clearly intended for more delicate work, and a longer, thicker one that provided better impact. The former was especially useful for Sarah's crafting, but if her intent was to have a sword to use against monsters, then the latter was by far the better choice. Since Rudy thought that both were useful to her though, he just recommended that she buy both. The thing is, carrying both swords would definitely be way too heavy for her. It would also get in the way of her using her bow. So, as a potential alternative, Rudy suggested getting a smaller knife to keep in her bag, in addition to that larger sword that was meant for fighting. It was the best option considering she needed a sword for making arrows, but to buy both was just a bit too expensive for her, leading Rudy to offer up some of his own money to pay for it. Since he rarely ever bought more than the bare necessities, he had actually amassed quite a bit of wealth the past year, certainly enough to help out Sarah and even a bit extra to buy some swords for himself. Now, it was after all that the two would window shop through the city's more expensive stores. Magical implements so exorbitant that even a full year's worth of adventuring wouldn't be able to afford them. They then proceeded to get some drinks, and it was here that Sarah's advances would give Rudy the courage to move forward a bit. He didn't want to be too hasty though, since if this relationship ended the same way that the one with Eris did, then he wasn't sure that he'd ever be able to recover. So after making sure that this was in fact what Sarah wanted, they would go back to his inn just like how we saw in the anime. The only difference between here and the disastrous aftermath was the innkeeper, who also happened to make a pretty good wingman. You see, when he saw that Rudy had finally brought a girl back home with him, he immediately ran to the kitchen, grabbed a flask, then tossed it to him. Rudy wasn't very familiar with alcohol, but by the looks of this one, it was definitely one of the more expensive ones. The innkeeper clearly wanted him to have a good time tonight. But what that flask ended up being used for instead was to wash away any memory of the disaster that just happened. The absolute mess that occurred as Rudy came to the realization that he was impotent. An important distinction that needs to be made from the anime is that Sarah's parting words weren't a direct attack on Rudy. Yes, she did think the whole thing was an absolute train wreck, but her saying awful wasn't her calling Rudy awful. She was just describing the situation in general. Since Rudy perceived it as her calling him a disaster though, he began to think that perhaps this was how Eris felt. Perhaps she had actually been unwilling that entire night. Perhaps she was just enduring how awful it was for Rudy's sake. Regardless of what it was, Rudy now felt a chill that could only be relieved by drinking, bringing us to his downward spiral and eventual encounter with Soldat. Rudy had never drunk alcohol to such an extent before, but now that he had, he found it felt surprisingly good. So much so that if he was to get alcohol poisoning and die, to die feeling this good would just be a miracle. It was as he got more and more drunk that his attitude became more and more like his former self. He began to notice he was lashing out in anger much like how he did in his old life. Then, the more he realized he was relapsing into his old self, the more he drank to make himself feel better about it. It was a vicious cycle fueled by his own remorse and regret, one that minimized all those years of progress he'd made. When Soldat entered the bar shortly after, the only reason he had confronted Rudy at all was to demand he leave so that he didn't have to be anywhere near his sorry face. Then, with the emotional breakdown capturing pretty much every aspect of the novels, we can skip ahead to their conversation after, the essence of which was that Rudy needed to stop lying to himself. The entire year he'd spent in Rosenberg, not once was he ever his true self. He had put up a mask and kept himself stiff and formal, which in turn caused the toxic buildup we saw just a moment ago. The lies he was telling himself were like a poison to him, constantly building up under the pressure of maintaining this false identity. The next thing Soldat said to get Rudy to feel better was a lecture on the futility of trying to understand women, a lesson that was essentially trying to get him to move on. He could spend all the time in the world contemplating the reasons why Eris left him, but the truth of the matter was that none would ever be the right one. So, if he kept harping on all these depressing situations that had no solutions, then it was only natural his life would become depressing too. What he needed to focus on instead was the root of the problem, something that could only be done through the help of a professional. They couldn't just go to a cheap place though, since the service there wouldn't be anything close to what Rudy needed. No, if he was gonna figure out the cause of his impotence, then any and all techniques were required for testing purposes, something that was only available from the more expensive locations. Now, normally Rudy wouldn't be caught anywhere near here, but part of him was actually pretty excited. In his old life, he would look down on those who came to places like this, but after feeling just how exhilarating the anticipation was, he now understood that he was just being naive and foolish. Even the act of going into the brothel would have been intimidating, but because he was following the likes of Soldat, for some reason it just felt easier. He seemed like the type of guy that you could just trust to lead you anywhere. He never did understand how Soldat was an S-ranked party leader, but after following him for only a few hours, Rudy felt it made a lot more sense now. Everything just felt a whole lot more safe with him. As for the reason he was a regular at this brothel, well, that's because relationships within his party were prohibited. If any two adventurers were found to even have feelings for each other, then both members would be asked to leave immediately. There was just too much risk in having that type of relationship present, much to the point that it became highly dangerous for everyone in the party. It was definitely natural for romantic bonds to be made in such high-pressure life-and-death situations, but Soldat had no problem cycling those people out as many times as he needed to. Sure, it was a hassle to bring in all these new members, but with a little tactical rework and a couple days of practice, his party would be running as good as new again. In any case, it was after the two arrived at the brothel that Soldat would order the most expensive itinerary for Rudy. Since pricing determined what the escorts would and wouldn't do, it was only natural they go with the one with the most options. He would then pick an escort that looked like Eris and proceed to what was essentially the cleansing part of the experience. This wasn't really all that important, but prior to even getting to see Elise, he was first taken to a bath where younger girls would clean literally every inch of him. It was an experience in itself that a younger Rudy would have salivated at, but unfortunately for him generated zero response still. Fast forward to the actual experience with Elise, and while the whole thing was extremely sensual, no amount of physical sensation would work on him. She had even gone so far as to try things not on the itinerary, but his body's response was always the same. Rudy could definitely see why she was considered a professional, but no matter how good those dreamlike sensations felt, everything just remained silent. Now, something the anime didn't include was the fact that Elise had accompanied Rudy all the way to when he left the Pleasure District. Since she wasn't able to help him with his problems, it was the least she could do to escort him outside. So, when Sarah had stumbled upon Rudy at the entrance of the Pleasure District, not only did she see him drunk with the person she hated most, but she also saw Rudy get a kiss from an escort he most likely slept with. It was an additional catalyst to an already explosive situation, one that cemented Rudy's fate to that of rejection. So, when all was said and done and Sarah's rejection made clear, what bothered Rudy the most was the inevitable repercussions. As adventurers, it was only natural that they'd run into each other again. For sure, Sarah was gonna keep looking at him with disgust, but it was the thought of Suzanne, Timothy, and Patrice doing the same that devastated him enough to want to end it all. He couldn't handle knowing that the only friendship he'd cultivated over the past year was effectively over in only a matter of seconds. It was a truly unbearable pain that he just didn't want to live with anymore. If not through death, then at the very least not by his lonesome. After coming so far and falling so flat, to him this was the most that he would ever amount to. He tried his best and reached his limit. There was no point to trying to do anything on his own anymore. Best to just go back to Paul and be with them. It was when Soldat accepted Rudy for who he was next that he also went on to admit his own faults. He acknowledged that he may have gone a bit too far when prodding him all the time, knowing now that there were some things that people just wanted kept secret. With yet another surprising statement showing his true character, Rudy now felt he fully understood why he was such a capable leader. Sure, he may have plenty of his own faults and shortcomings, but his good traits far outweighed the bad ones. It was a point made clear by the fact he had spent the entire night looking out for him, the same night he should have spent preparing to leave for the labyrinth. So it was that realization combined with his desire to not be alone that led Rudy to the decision to go along with him, bringing us now to the end of episode 3. Episode 28, Letter of Invitation, covering the prologue in chapter 1 of volume 8 of the light novel. After yet another tragic tale of misunderstanding, Rudy would spend a year accompanying Soldat all throughout the Northern Territories. He would jump from town to town and do pretty much the exact same thing that he did in Rosenberg, temporarily join parties in hopes of spreading the name and story of Rudius. At first, Rudy thought Stepped Leader wouldn't be so receptive to him, but to his surprise they were actually quite welcome. Since a lot were brought in under the same circumstances that he was, they were rather respectful with regards to how they treated him. Not only understanding his purpose for being there, but also giving him the distance he needed to be himself. Occasionally, Rudy would think back to how things had ended with Counter Arrow, but with zero news coming back to him about what they were up to, he could only assume they either got new members or just went back to Asura altogether. As for his thoughts on Sarah, well, that was something that he'd come to regret. Just like how Sarah wished to apologize for the way things ended, it turns out that Rudy wanted to as well. He felt if there was one thing that he could go back and do, it would be to talk to Sarah one last time just so they could settle things properly. Knowing how much of a distraction Counter Arrow was to his objective though, Rudy knew it was for the best that he didn't. He didn't seem to realize it at the time, but the friendship he'd made with them had caused him to become complacent. They were the sole reason he wasn't able to move on from Rosenberg. So, despite regretting not saying anything, the stress of trying to seek forgiveness just wasn't worth the hassle of staying behind for them. To him, it was far easier to just move on. Not to mention productive since his primary goal was to search for Zenith after all. This could very well just be his excuse to make himself feel better, but the truth of the matter was that relationships like that were unnecessary now. If he had time to worry about girls, then he had time to search for Zenith. And it was that way of thinking that would take all the weight off his chest. So, as he would occasionally remember his first times with Eris, Sarah, and Elise, it was the imperative nature of the job at hand that made it easy to let go of all his regrets, thus helping him to spread his name more effectively. Now, something I forgot to mention from last episode was the interesting bit of foreshadowing left out from Alina Lise's post-credits scene. You see, before she had even gone to interrupt these two adventurers, they were first talking about the dire state of Asura, a reality that was hinted at by the shabby state of the guild itself. It's not something that was made quite apparent, but if you were paying attention, you would have noticed just how empty the building was. It was just these two, an elf and a receptionist. As for why that is, well, that would be due to the poor state of the kingdom. Asura was very close to the brink of destruction. Not only was it evident on the faces of its people, but it was a well-known rumor that High Minister Darius was eager for war. You see, when a country's backed into a corner and low on resources, war usually becomes their only option, especially for a prideful one that considers itself the strongest. So, with the state of the kingdom in tatters, the people were the ones currently suffering. They were so entrenched in their own problems that they couldn't even afford to seek out help from the Adventurers Guild. Thus the reason the request board was barren, and so too the building itself. Plus, with so few adventurers coming through and visiting, any requests that did pop up were mostly ignored. It was a massive slump that further alluded to Asura's imminent downfall. Now, you may not remember from my episode 0 cut content, but this was actually something Ariel's mage predicted would happen. At first, Asura was this powerhouse everyone thought would conquer the entire continent, but when they saw just how hard it was to live in the north, they instead decided to settle in the territory they already had. leading them to stagnate while those on their borders advanced. So, while those around them made progress in both magic and technology, Asura went on to produce nothing. They instead chose to indulge in the prosperity of their own natural resources, consuming and consuming until, well, there was nothing left to consume. With this bringing them to their current path of destruction, it was only a matter of time until war broke out. Either them or their neighbors would be the one to start it, but whatever the outcome, those at the top were sure to be replaced. Only after the dust was settled and a new monarch in power would the adventurers finally return and do their job again. Reason being that should any remain when the war begins, then any and all would be stuck in Asura until after. So unless you wanted to be caught right in the middle of that, then the best option was to flee before the borders closed. As it would turn out for these two adventurers, Alina Lise would provide them with such a great night that they would completely forget their earlier caution and linger within Asura until that very war started. A story that's apparently saved for a different time. Now, one last thing that pertains to the political affairs of Asura is the disbandment of the official search and rescue squad. After 5 long years and a whole lot of money, the minister Darius had finally decided to cut off funding for it, effectively declaring the whole displacement incident over. Of course, that was far from true, but whatever refugees remained finally began to switch from searching for survivors to reclaiming their livelihoods. It was a sudden decision that came as a direct result of Eris being declared dead. With all other Boreas Grey Rats confirmed dead as well, Darius saw zero need to continue using the search and rescue squad to find them. So feel free to take that information whatever way you want, but just know that I doubt Darius was looking for them just so that he could rescue them. And obviously Eris isn't dead, but it's definitely best that she be considered as such. Fast forward now to present day, and Rudy would still show immense infatuation towards his muscles. To him, so long as he paid attention to them, they were sure to never betray him, unlike a couple of other women he knew. So he would wake up and do his training, eat a massive meal despite it being expensive, then pray to his relic the same way that he always did. This would be his daily routine for the past year or so. Normally he would then go to the guild and join whatever party on their B to S ranked missions, but today a familiar face decided to recruit him instead. An S-ranked adventurer we know as Soldat, who we find out is advanced in the Sword God style and intermediate in the Water God style. As the leader of one of the many high-ranked parties controlled by the Thunderbolt clan, he was currently looking for an additional mage to assist with the dragon slaying quest, a hunt for a stray worm that was causing quite a bit of havoc nearby. Normally, such a job would require a minimum of at least 40 adventurers, but today they only had 25. It was a diverse group that consisted of 1 S-ranked party and 4 A-ranked ones. The thing is, with only half of what was required to even attempt the quest, many were nervous about whether it was even possible or not. There was this looming sense of uncertainty that caused one of the parties to back out immediately. So, with 21 left and more about to leave as well, Soldat quickly stepped in to prevent that. He wasn't about to let such a massive quest slip right through his fingers, especially not one with such an immense payday on the line. So, before any other party could announce their departure too, Soldat declared that those remaining would be the ones committing, and he had done so with such an overwhelming authority that no one present would even dare step in to say otherwise, thus leading these 21 on an adventure to slay a dragon. The fight was pretty much as we saw in the anime, but in case you're wondering about any of the specifics, it was essentially a 1v1 with Rudy the entire time. The dragon immediately recognized Rudy as the biggest threat, and as such went to eliminate him first. Rudy, being the intuitive fighter he was though, not only took advantage of his environment to create a smokescreen out of fire and snow, but also ran the opposite direction of his party so that all the others could have time to flee. He would then protect himself with a wall of water, then launch numerous earthen bullets so strong that even the dragon became afraid of them. You may not have noticed, but it was actually in this moment the dragon knew he messed up. It had come to realize just how powerful Rudy was here, and as a result turned to flee since it knew now Rudy couldn't be beaten, leading itself straight into Rudy's quagmire previously intended for the Luster Grizzlies. With that cementing the dragon's fate, Rudy would remain humble and allow all those present to share in his bounty. Of course, they all knew that he had done everything, but Rudy insisted they share in the riches anyway. It's not like he could even carry it all, and leaving the body to rot could potentially have it turn into a zombie dragon later. It was in the next scene with Rudy at the pub that we find out the people singing his song was a troubadour called the Big Boys Orchestra. A C-ranked party whose skills weren't quite noteworthy, but their passion for music was evident by their desire to become famous for it. They had recently quizzed Rudius on his adventure with the dragon, then quickly made it into a song in hopes of being the first to do so. It certainly wasn't the best song he'd ever heard, but their ability to create something new based on events Rudius recounted for them was a level of creativity he knew he'd never be capable of. Back when he was still in the real world, there was a time when Rudy had tried to create a song on Vocaloid, but after that failed miserably and killed his self-confidence, the only instrument he'd ever claimed to play after was the ass drum. Something I'm sure you don't need me to explain. In any case, it's everything after this that follows the anime quite closely. Probably the closest we've gotten from any episode in Season 2 so far. Alina Lise came in and told Rudy where Zenith was, then his main concern became figuring out how he was going to get there. It was a task indefinitely delayed by the winter. So while he stayed put waiting for the season to pass, we would learn more about him and his particular condition. As it turns out, the longer his useless friend remained unusable, the more he became overcome by these feelings of loneliness and helplessness. Then, the more times he tried and failed to fix himself, the more he came to realize this wasn't a problem that someone else could solve. It was a sad realization that ultimately led him to just give up. Now, one of the things the anime didn't really showcase was the more personal details that developed Alina Lise's character better. You see, other than just being this sex-crazed elf lady, she's also an S-ranked warrior who's actually quite caring. She's definitely not on the same level as Ruijerd, but from the few elimination quests Rudy had taken on with her, she had shown quite a bit of skill befitting her S rank. Then we already know how capable she is around men, but when it comes to women she becomes more like this older sister to them, often giving them advice ranging from that of relationships, all the way to how to handle themselves in combat. If there was one single rule she always abided by though, it was that she would never seduce any man who was already involved with someone. If she could tell that they already had a partner, then she would stay away as to not cause any sort of lover's quarrel. Of course, there would always be the few men who become infatuated with her, but that would rarely, if ever, turn into bloodshed. Even so, her notoriety had caused her to become quite well known across the central continent, so much so that there was actually an unspoken rule that she couldn't join anyone's party. At least not unless it was under some special circumstances anyway. In any case, Alina Lise would be the adventurer Rudy would party up with. Since she insisted she would stay with him until he was safely in the Begarit continent, Rudy saw no issue having a reliable partner travel with him. If there was one thing that the past 2 years had taught him, it was just how difficult it was to travel alone. So, aside from the times that she would invade his personal space, having this strong warrior as a companion was certainly helpful. Now, the last thing worth mentioning was a whole excerpt from Rudy's letter about some kind of research project. Apparently, if he's able to complete one project within the 7 years before he graduates, then the Magician's Guild will enroll him into their ranks as a C-ranked member. Of course, under the condition he transfers all the rights of his findings to them. Even if he isn't able to complete one though, so long as he graduates he'll still become a D-ranked member. I'm not sure what exactly these ranks do for him, but I'm sure obtaining one is quite prestigious. For reference, the mage Rudy had gone to talk to here was only an F rank, mainly because he was a dropout. So, this could just be a way for the university to benefit off the research of their students, but there could also be some merit to it. Regardless, it's an interesting proposition that adds yet another element to Rudy's time at the university, something I'm sure they'll bring up next episode. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this episode's cut content. There was one interesting line Hitogami said during the dream sequence, but the implications of it are too vague to really speculate on. It was just something along the lines of how he couldn't reach out to Rudy because a lot was happening on his end. Then the reason Alina Lise was in his bed after was because she couldn't find a single person to sleep with her that night. It seems whenever she returns to bed alone, she finds herself lonely and unable to sleep anymore. So that's why she had gone over to Rudy's bed. Episode 29. Renoa University of Magic, covering chapters 2 and 3 from Volume 8 of the light novel. As the largest country in the central continent's northern region, Renoa was quite similar in terms of power to the Shirone Kingdom. What Renoa had that Shirone didn't, though, was an alliance that made it part of the Magic Nations, a group with intimate ties to the Magician's Guild that worked together to advance the field of magic. This group was so invested in this very cause that they'd even gone so far as to create a city specifically to lead it, a place that, as we know, Rudy now finds himself in. So, right at the outer edge of Renoa is a grand city containing not only the University of Magic, but also the Magicians Guild headquarters and even Neris's workshop for magical implements. They were all shoved together into the magic city of Sharia, a thriving hub for magic that effectively served as the center of the magic nations as a whole. Now, just as Rudy had mentioned, it was along this journey that Alinalize's curse was brought up. The anime may have underplayed it a bit with those quotations, but this is actually a legitimate curse that could potentially kill her. You see, back when they were traveling and going from city to city, the two had accidentally taken a wrong turn somewhere. So, rather than arrive at the city that they were supposed to, they had instead spent a week on the road trying to find their way back to it, a detour in which Alinalize's health deteriorated rapidly. Her face turned pale and her body frail, and no amount of healing or detoxification magic could do anything about it. So, it was then that Alinalize told Rudy that if she didn't periodically sleep with men, then eventually she would die. This wasn't something she was particularly upset about, since even if she wasn't cursed, she would still live the exact same way anyway. It was just more of like this minor inconvenience for her. In any case, Alinalize was here to find, well, younger men. She would have to pay tuition unlike Rudy, but for someone like her, an expense like that was marginal. You see, a lifetime of exploring labyrinths has made her quite rich. Like, rich. She usually carries 5 Asuran gold coins at any given time, as well as several orb-shaped crystals each valued at 10 gold coins. That may not sound like very much, but with the Asuran gold coin being the highest form of currency in the world, just one was enough to let you live comfortably for months. I mean, the entire 7-year tuition was only 3 gold coins. With that not even making a dent in her savings, Alinalize was free to do pretty much anything. Now, an interesting thing to note about the university itself is that the entire thing was built out of magic-resistant bricks. Special constructs crafted right here in Renoa, capable of repelling mana and withstanding even large-scale magical attacks. You didn't see them very often elsewhere, but with the Magicians Guild having a monopoly on their sale and production, it made sense that they'd be prevalent within the magic nations. The only place you'd ever see them outside was in the Asuran capital. No one knew how it was they were made, but if they were so commonly present throughout the magic nations, then Rudy imagined it couldn't be that expensive to make. It was likely the Magicians Guild was just selling them at a massive premium. Fast forward to Rudy's meeting with Vice Principal Genus, and there was a certain excitement that came when Rudy confirmed he was enrolling. Since most young, skilled adventurers tended to develop oversized egos, Genus was quite shocked when Rudy showed himself to be quite humble. What he expected was a prideful kid who thought themselves to be the best, but what he got instead was a modest student eager to learn. It was a display of respect that had Rudy contemplate his own run-ins with adventurers like that. The first was a 14-year-old B-ranked boy who considered him to be his rival, and the second was a 15-year-old B-ranked girl named Sarah. The former got themselves killed while doing an extermination quest, and the latter was just someone he preferred not to think about. When we get to Rudy's test next, the only thing not mentioned from the walk there was the fact that the teachers were only skilled up to the king rank. If anyone wanted to learn from an emperor or higher, then unfortunately this university wouldn't be the place for them. That said, it'd be extremely tough to find teachers who were better, since the professors here were far more skilled than the ones even at Asura's Royal Academy. It was once Rudy had gotten to the gym that the vice principal would point out the mock battles being held by the 4th years here. You see, the only reason Sylphie was even here to begin with was because her class, mostly consisting of noble ancestry, was currently in the middle of battle simulations. It turns out combat experience is a very core part of the curriculum here. Part of the reason they could do this without any issues is because the floor itself was engraved with numerous healing circles, Saint tier markings within an advanced tier barrier that not only withstood quite a bit of magic, but also healed anyone within almost immediately. It wasn't as strong as the king tier circle from Shirane, but since that one was also capable of blocking physical damage, it was a fundamentally different creation from this one. So, while normally Rudy's test would have just been him showcasing voiceless magic in front of the professor who taught such a skill had unfortunately died, leaving Genus to make the quick decision to go and grab Sylphie. He knew Sylphie wouldn't be even close to Rudius's skill, but at the very least he hoped she could assess his capabilities. Now, something I'm sure many of you are probably wondering is how it is Rudy didn't recognize the wand he gave her. Well, after 10 years of using Aqua Hartia, the only thing the wand reminded him of was the one he happened to use that looked just like it. An interesting thing to note about the fight itself is that, if not for a last split-second decision made by Rudy, there was a good chance he could have killed Sylvie right there and then. It was after he'd used his Disturb magic and prepped his stone cannon that the resulting projectile would be aimed directly at her face. That's right, a stone bullet capable of penetrating dragon scales was about to be launched at top speed straight to Sylvie's head. If not for Rudy changing his mind partway through, then the instant death caused by it would have been too much for any circle to heal. So, aside from the fact that Rudy almost killed her, the more astonishing thing was his application of Disturb magic. Yet again, Rudy had come across several mages unsure as to what it even was. In the past 2 years adventuring all the way back to his time in Season 1, there still wasn't a single person he'd seen use this magic except for Orsted. In any case, Rudy beating Sylvie here was his ticket into the university, bringing us to 1 month later where he'd finally settled in as a full-fledged student. To add on to what it means to be a special student, so long as you weren't committing crimes, destroying the school, or talking bad about the Magician's Guild, the special students could do pretty much anything. Whether it be spending all day eating food in the cafeteria, or training non-stop in the practice buildings, the school and its facilities were his to explore. He could even go off campus and do some adventuring if he wanted to. When it came to the more promiscuous things, he was surprised to know that the school didn't care about that either. So long as the encounters were consensual, students could go and do whatever they wanted with each other. It was a rule or lack thereof that made Alina Lise's life a whole lot easier. To us, such a policy might be a little bit strange, but when you consider the wide range of ages and races constituting the student population, it was only natural the norms be a little bit different. So, unlike how acts like that would negatively affect public morals in our world, here they were completely natural. The university clearly wanted to make this place as accommodating as possible. Whatever they could do to stimulate the growth of their students, they were willing to do all for the sake of advancing magic. In fact, the university was so focused on doing exactly that it didn't matter who or what you were, so long as you had mana and could cast magic, you were eligible to enroll as a student here. It was an open-door policy that included even those with questionable backgrounds. This did invite a bit of opposition from Asura and Millis, but with one having invested copious amounts of money into the university's research and the other being on the complete opposite side of the world, neither were ready to start a war over it. That didn't stop Millis's temple knights from expressing their disdain, but that was really about all they could do. So, all in all, it was the world's greatest magic school led by the Wind King George. A massive institution housing well over 10,000 students. Where do these students stay, you might ask? Well, with an enormous 5-story dorm located right on campus, most students doubled up to share a single room here. Special students got to live alone, but you could always pay to live in a bigger room typically intended for nobles. It was the more secure option for those like Princess Ariel. Fast forward to the opening ceremony, and this was where we should have gotten our introduction to the principal. The Wind King George, who was right in the middle of preaching his classic sermon about magic. If there was one thing he liked to talk about, it was the fact that magicians weren't inferior to swordsmen. Most of the world may very well think that way, but George was out here on a mission to prove otherwise. He didn't deny that the sword styles created by the sword gods were works of art on their own, but unlike magic, those were tools simply intended to kill. To him, magic had a future far greater than that of swordsmanship. And that was the core principle he would always preach to the students. When Ariel had come to give her speech next, the charisma Rudy was referring to was the element of her speech that just made it pleasant to listen to. There was something about the way she spoke that just made him compelled to do what she was saying. Now, prior to Rudy's arrival at his class, Genus had first urged him to be careful when interacting with the other students. Apparently, each were a bit on the more eccentric side. So much so that a literal warning had to be placed outside for the normal students. Out of the 4 students he saw within, the one he recognized was also the one his eye of foresight showed running towards him like a snowplow. He didn't even bother to avoid the desks, but instead ran straight through them, launching them in each and every direction. Of course, Rudy had tried to stop his charge with a stone cannon strong enough to knock someone unconscious, but the moment his attack reached Xanaba's face, it simply exploded to zero effect whatsoever. It was a comedic scene that would have given us a good look into just how durable Xanaba is. We knew he was a blessed child back from Season 1, but the extent of his powers are still yet to be known. I mean, even Xanaba himself can't control them properly. Normally that would cause him to be treated like a cursed child, but since the Magician's Guild liked to keep him around as a specimen for study, this third prince from the Shirane Kingdom was now a special student studying abroad. With regards to the two Doldia next, normally their piercing gazes would have made him quite uncomfortable, but after dealing with truly scary people such as Ruijerd, there was a certain lack of murderous intent that just made these two seem, well, docile. Zeniba did wonder why Rudy was being so passive with them, but after explaining how it was best to avoid unnecessary conflicts, Zeniba accepted it as another one of his master's wise teachings. That's not to say that Rudy would just allow bullying though, cause if he did ever see them do such a thing in the future, then Rudy resolved himself to step in no matter what. For him, bullying was an absolute no-no. Now, something they didn't include from Rudy's conversation with Cliff was an additional inquiry Rudy had about Eris. You see, after hearing that the two had spoken, Rudy was curious as to what Eris had said about him. When Cliff responded stating that she said he was small, Rudy's mind immediately went to down there. With one word, all his worst fears were all but confirmed. It made him think back at how Sarah's expression gave off that exact same vibe too. So, from one misunderstanding to yet another, Rudy was finally certain that it was in fact the sex that had driven Eris away. He would then mention how the two had parted ways and how he'd grown since then, but for Cliff he could only express just how unsuitable Rudy was for her. They were words that pierced his heart like daggers. Aside from that, we also learned that Rudy had essentially given up on the path of the sword, stating how his intermediate skills in the sword god style are pretty much the best he was capable of. Then the master Silent Zeniba was referring to was actually hinted at to not be Silent Fits like how some of you may have assumed. You see, not only was this mysterious person responsible for creating magical implements and adding items to the school's menu, but they were also the person who suggested uniforms be part of the school's curriculum. Then, the most important fact about her was that her enrollment came as a direct result of a recommendation from one of the 7 great powers. So, considering that we've only met one of those, I'm sure you can imagine who it is that person recommended. It was during Rudy's encounter with Fitz after that the mention of the book by AniNews would lead to a bit of investigation. The book was a creative non-fiction that told the tale of AniNews' exploration of the teleportation labyrinth. With the labyrinth housing traps only related to teleportation, the actual traversal of it became rather difficult. It was from what AniNews and his companions could find that they were able to narrow the traps down into 3 broad categories. The first was a one-way teleporter that sent people to the same fixed location, the second a reciprocal teleporter that led to a magic circle allowing for teleportation back, then the third a random teleporter which, well, could take you anywhere. All of which had a good chance to send you straight to a pack of monsters since the creatures inhabiting this labyrinth were both intelligent and cunning. Not only did they understand the labyrinth's complex layout, but they also knew where every teleporter would send someone, often waiting at the destination to hunt whoever it was that was using them. In any case, it was after AniNews had found a way to determine which teleporters were reciprocal and which were not that he would only use reciprocals to bring himself deeper. The plan itself was working rather fine, but it was a single misstep that would cause him to use a random one by accident. A fatal mistake that would cause him to lose his entire party and one of his arms. Fortunately, he survived, but with no way to defend himself in the labyrinth anymore, he decided to leave the conquering of it to the reader. Thus the reason he had written this book. The rest of the book was filled with theories about random teleportation, but there was nothing concrete other than a few hypotheses. The only one Rudy taking note of being the reason why teleportation won't ever teleport someone into the earth itself. Sure, you can teleport someone directly into an underground cave, but because there was resistance between the mana of the person and the mana at the destination, you would never actually be able to send a person into a wall, floor, or ceiling. It was the same principle that prevented people from casting magic right into a person's body. Perhaps there were a few exceptions to this, but the amount of magical power required to even test it was so obscene that even Rudy couldn't fathom it. Something I'm surprised the anime didn't show after was the full cafeteria scene which highlighted the hierarchy of the university. With the caf having 3 floors in total, the first was for adventurers and demon folk, the second for human commoners and beast folk, then the third for human royalty and nobility. Reason being that there would probably be some conflicts if nobility was to eat amongst the peasants. Rudy had no problem eating on the first floor, but for some reason Zeniba insisted they eat on the third. He refused to sit next to the heathens that didn't know even the most basic table manners. The reason Rudy didn't want to sit amongst the nobles was because his disheveled appearance made himself stick out quite clearly. Not only was he wearing the same tattered robe he'd worn his entire life, but the contrast with what the nobles were wearing was as if they were in suits and he was in sweatpants. It was a stark difference that made him quite uncomfortable. Even more so when Luke appeared behind him and gave him that stern talking to. So, with Luke and his groupies making things even more awkward, Rudy had come up with the compromise to eat outside, leading to that scene with the two of them in the courtyard. This wasn't a place people would normally eat lunch, but with a little bit of earth magic, Rudy had created his own little cafe of sorts, giving the two the opportunity to talk more about Luke, Ariel, and Fitz. Now, if you're wondering why Xanaba of all people knows so much about them, well, that's because Linnea and Prasenna had forced him to investigate them. It wasn't a result of bullying like how you may think, but instead a simple concession of defeat after Xanaba had somehow lost them. He didn't specify what it was he lost, but for the time being that answer would suffice to delay Rudy's intervention. In any case, that would be it until Rudy's endeavor with the panties, a scene that was quite accurate all the way to the end of the episode. The only thing I think they could have highlighted a little bit better was Rudy's confusion at the fact a boy was washing girls' underwear in the girls' dorm, a scenario he concluded was a result of Fitz being an honest, reliable bodyguard. Prior to anything that happened in the episode, there was first an entire chapter relating to Sylphie and one of her regular school days. She'd just woken up from an amazing dream and her body was feeling great because of it. It was a dream in which Rudy had just made love to her. She didn't remember why that was, but what she did remember was just how happy it made her. So, Sylphie would then put on her typical jogging clothes, then tiptoe through the room next to hers which housed a sleeping princess. A princess we can assume is Princess Ariel, but the identity of the person next to her is a bit more up to debate here. A key thing you need to remember is that at this point in the novels, Fitz's identity is still a mystery. Sylphie's whereabouts haven't been mentioned since the Fatoa incident, and this would be the first time we're seeing her since then. That being the case, it becomes a rather peculiar situation when Sylphie refers to the person next to the princess as Fitz, an attendant just like her who's described to have white hair, a sword at their side, and a large pair of sunglasses. If it wasn't for the mention of this Fitz having a sword, then I would assume Sylphie was just describing herself, an alter ego she created that the author is using as a misdirect. But since the description doesn't quite match, I'm inclined to believe that it's a separate person, especially since the job of this person is to watch the princess while she sleeps and ring a bell if there's ever any trouble. An alarm which would then summon the princess's knight and another attendant. Obviously, we know that knight to be Luke, so we can only assume the other attendant is Sylphie. The thing is, what makes this whole scenario so strange is not only the Fitz person Sylphie is supposedly talking to, but the confusing statements after in which Sylphie describes him as her friend and even a student she teaches voiceless casting to. It seems they really want to make it clear that Fitz and Sylphie are separate people here. Of course, we know that not to be true, but it's that very knowledge that just goes to make this whole thing all the more confusing. In any case, Sylphie's daily routine would start with a jog, something she'd started ever since Rudy left, since to her being able to run even after you were at your limit could very well be the difference between life and death. It didn't matter how good you were at magic or swordplay, because if you ran out of energy, then that was it for you. So every day, Sylphie would train her stamina to the point that she could run no longer. Not only did this help her familiarize herself with Sharia's layout, but it also taught her what her limits were. Once back at the university dorm, the princess would usually be awake, and that would mean it was time for Fitz and herself to help her get ready. She would sometimes make these selfish requests, but that was all part of working for her. She did, after all, save her during the displacement incident. It may have been for the princess's own personal benefit, but that was all part of her character too. You see, after years of seeing her smile in a way that bewitched others, Sylphie had come to realize that the princess only smiled for herself. She would put on a face that reassured those she was talking to, then use their lowered defenses to manipulate them in whatever way was most beneficial to her. It was a tactic that this princess used frequently, one that made Sylphie question whether any of her smiles were real. As insincere as these expressions were though, Sylphie still believed Ariel to be her friend. Perhaps even her best friend. Ariel may not think the same, but the truth of the matter was that she had helped Sylphie when Sylphie needed it most. So if this was the trying time in which Sylphie could return the favor, then Sylphie was more than happy to do so. She also just liked being able to help people. Ever since she'd found out her parents had died during the displacement incident, there wasn't really anything Sylphie wanted to do. Sure, if something came up, then she would definitely shift her focus to it, but until then, assisting the princess was something she was content with. there was a certain satisfaction that came from knowing she was helping someone with such lofty ambitions. If we switch to Sylphie's classes next, most of them were rather boring to her. Since a lot were on combined magic and the phenomenon created by it, they were nowhere near as comprehensive as the lessons Rudius had given her. Reason being that, rather than explain why these phenomena occurred, they would instead ignore the explanation completely. There was this significant gap in knowledge stemming from a lack of scientific understanding. As for why Sylphie participated anyway, well, that's because graduating meant becoming part of the Magician's Guild. And according to her, being a member meant you could easily become a professor of magic anywhere. The class that Sylphie did find a bit more interesting was the practical skills class, which focused more on battle experience. Since this was taken amongst those who were adventurers, the mock battles she took part in proved to be invaluable. A lot of the students didn't like it when their oldest classmate Fricht would run around the arena and use both magic and melee attacks, but that was just a testament to how serious he took this. It was a display of resolve that reminded her of Rudy, one that she had grown rather fond of. Now, once all her classes were finished, Sylphie would return to looking after the princess, a task that today would involve a shopping trip. The trip itself wasn't very important, but there was a brief moment in which Sylphie envisioned her ideal relationship. Basically, she wanted monogamy. She wasn't a member of the Millis faith, but ideally she would want Rudy to be hers alone. Of course, knowing Rudy and the family he comes from, she knew it was a bit much to expect Rudy to settle with one wife, and it was for that reason that she knew she needed to keep an open mind about it. So, if Rudy did ever bring another girl home, then Sylphie knew her best course of action as his wife was to act as the mediator. She would acknowledge that Rudy loved her too, maintain a balanced relationship between all three of them, then do her best to keep everyone happy. That was the life Sylphie envisioned with Rudius. Okay, episode 30, I Don't Wanna Die, covering chapters 4 and 5 from volume 8 of the light novel. With the month having passed since enrollment, we start things off with Rudy continuing his training regiment, a program that a lot of you may be familiar with as it directly references the same one that Saitama used. Since Rudy didn't want to lose all his hair though, he figured he would just have to work a little bit harder than him. It was as he would do this training that he would occasionally spot this one girl doing the same thing that he was. He couldn't recognize who she was, but he could definitely see just how fit she was. When that and the ensuing magic training were finished, Rudy would then grab breakfast with Zanaba, head to the library for research, eat lunch with Zanaba, then go to classes on healing magic, divine magic, and barrier magic. Before we get to the details of those classes though, there were times when Alina Lise would check up on him, but because he was always with Zanaba, she would never stay very long since to her, Zanaba wasn't a good man. As for the lunch itself, the dish they keep showing over and over is called Nana Hoshiyaki, a kind of pseudo-karage that was often served with a curry look-alike. If you remember what I mentioned last episode, then I think it's safe to assume that these were the menu items added by that Master Silent Zanaba was referring to. Now, the anime only mentioned each of Rudy's classes briefly, but there was actually a few lessons from each that Rudy found quite interesting. The healing class didn't really cover anything helpful to his specific problem, but the other two did seem rather useful. So, for divine magic, he found it worked similarly to disturb magic. It was the practice of using raw mana to attack the enemy. Normally, mana would be channeled then transformed into some form of element, but if the enemy was something like a ghost-type creature, then a pure mana attack could be used to damage it. Of course, an attack like that didn't actually do damage to other things, so a skilled divine magician needed to be able to analyze and modify their magic accordingly. Changing your magic to counter your opponent was apparently crucial in combat. As for barrier magic, this was more so used to isolate magic. It was a highly practical tool that served as the core concept behind the magic-resistant bricks. Usually such barriers were constructed through magic circles, but at the beginner level they could also be made with incantations. These were typically barriers that could only block magic. The intermediate level taught those to create barriers that blocked physical attacks, then at the saint level and above the two could be combined into a single barrier, at which point they became highly useful in both protection and confinement. This was something Rudy would unfortunately never learn here though, since the rights to divine and barrier magic were owned by Millis. The teacher was definitely capable of teaching it, but the very practice of doing so was illegal. If he or anyone else was caught teaching it above the basic level, then the Millis faith would hunt them down and put them on trial. It was a direct violation of the law that Millis took very seriously. That being the case, Rather than focus on how to create these barriers and strengthen them, Rudy's class instead focused on how to shatter them. It was all essentially a review of what Roxy had taught him. When we get to the library with Fitz next, it turns out the Fatoa incident may not have been as unique as we initially thought it was. Through all the books that Rudius has been reading, he discovered various incidents fundamentally similar to Fatoa's. Sure, they weren't as large in scale, but there were numerous cases in which people abruptly disappeared then returned from somewhere completely different. He had essentially found that this wasn't the first instance of people suddenly getting spirited away one day. In fact, it was actually quite the frequent phenomenon. Sylphie had been trying to research the same, but rather than look into teleportation as a whole, she was instead trying to see if there was a pattern behind it. If she could figure out a pattern in the way people were teleported, then perhaps she could make finding specific individuals easier. That was her approach before Rudy found her. Of course, Sylphie felt bad that she was never actually able to search for Rudy, but Rudy understood that Fitz had his own life to live. The fact he was even able to do research while protecting the princess was amazing. Even more so when you consider how he leveraged his position to gain access to places in which that research could even be done. So, considering the extent Fitz had gone to find his friend, Rudy truly believed that that was enough. Now, it was during their walk home that Sylphie would comment on the whole Zanaba situation. You see, as someone who was at the school before him, she was actually witness to just how much of a troublemaker he was. Obviously, he's not so much now, but apparently after he enrolled, he would try to fight pretty much everyone. It was a time of havoc that would last until Linnea and Persena stepped in. We don't know exactly what they did, but as the widely proclaimed leaders of the delinquents, they had apparently challenged Zanaba and beat him 2-on-1. It was a simple challenge that the two won rather easily. So it was ever since then that Zanaba would be treated as their underling. Linnea and Persena would then try to do the same thing against the princess, but Sylphie had stepped in and defeated them 1-on-2. It was a humiliating defeat that declared Sylphie the strongest. In fact, in her entire time here at the school, there wasn't a single person who could beat her 1-on-1. She had never lost a fight until the one with Rudius, which I guess by the transitive property makes him the strongest now. So, as Sylphie gave her warnings for each of the special students, she would even mention how Master Silent was a troublemaker. Not so much now just like Zanaba, but even she had caused several problems back when she first enrolled. In any case, that would be it for the stuff with Sylphie. Where that brings us to next then is Rudy's more precarious situation with Zanaba. His lustful passion was something Rudy would never judge him for because after walking in on him in this scene here, that was all that was needed to show just how serious he was. It didn't matter what his motives for figure making were because any person willing to get frostbite rubbing up against bronze in the cold of winter is definitely not faking their dedication for it. So, seeing just how passionate and impatient Zanaba was getting, Rudy finally decided to start training him. Of course, that wasn't without hoping to get something out of it for himself though. You see, because he knew just how rich Zanaba was, Rudy believed he could help him make a profitable business of sorts. If he could eventually come to make use of his assets, then somewhere down the line he could start coloring and mass-producing his figurines. This world already had the technology to create bronze and Western-styled statues, so all it needed to mass-produce others was just a little reappropriation. His plan was to start with the Roxy figure, then hopefully move on to Ruijerd, after which he would write a couple books on them, then sell the two together as part of a bundle. It was a multi-phased plan that first needed to start with Zanaba, thus the reason Rudy was going to take teaching him seriously. Just as we saw in the anime though, Zanaba didn't have nearly enough mana to make even one figure. It was the first time Rudy had come face to face with just how much greater his own mana pool was. His entire life he thought his was at most 5 times bigger, but after seeing Zanaba struggle with something he could do hundreds of times over, that's when Rudy began to realize that perhaps his was significantly bigger. Apparently, making figurines was a highly mana-intensive task that not just anyone could imitate. So, when the chiseling method didn't work either, that's when Rudy would seek out Sylphie's help, bringing us to the whole suggestion of getting a slave to do it. If you're wondering why Sylphie had even suggested that, well, the justification was pretty much this.
I had to participate in the custom.
Well, you'd be morally irresponsible if you did not participate in the custom.
It seems when someone in the capital didn't have the skills to do what they wanted, they would instead buy a slave and teach them how to do it. A suggestion that made Rudy think, well, why not just cut out the middleman? If he could spend his days living in Shirone's royal palace making figures and lots of money too, then that didn't seem like too much of a bad idea to him. to him, being Zanaba's personal figure maker didn't seem all that bad. So that was a job he kept in the back of his head in case he ever needed one. Now, as much as it was a surprise to Rudy, according to Sylphie, buying a slave to do something you couldn't do was widely accepted across the world. Zanaba didn't like the notion of his master teaching a slave over him, but considering the circumstances of what led them to this, it was the only option left that could possibly work for him. So, unlike how it is in Milis or the Central Continent, the slave trade here was legalized, resulting in it becoming a core part of its economy. Thus the reason there was a place to purchase them right in the heart of the commerce district. In fact, for a city as large as this one, there were actually 5 slave markets from which Rudy could choose from. Since each catered to a different type of client though, Rudy had decided to focus on a more beginner-friendly one that tended to sell to the more wealthy clientele. Now, a comedic scene the anime didn't include involving Zanaba was yet another showcase of his powers as a blessed child. You see, Rudy had tried talking to the person managing the information center, but as soon as that person saw the wealthy-looking noble behind him, he completely ignored Rudy and went to him instead. Zanaba didn't like the fact that his master had just been ignored, so in a classic Zanaba move, he clawed the person's face, held him up with one single hand, then threatened to rip his jaw off if he ever did it again. I know this doesn't sound very funny, but it's the way Zanaba literally shrugs off the burly guards trying to subdue him that really just adds to the whole ridiculous nature of his character. Like, all he had to do to fling these guards was just slightly move a bit. Something about this that was a bit more interesting was actually Sylphie's reaction to it. You see, the moment the guards had started trying to seize Zanaba, Sylphie immediately stepped in front of Rudy ready to protect him. She was agile, quick, and even had her wand up already, showing both us and Rudy just how skilled she'd become. It was after the merchant came and calmed everyone down that the trio would then head to the back to go see Julie, a young girl whose parents were both dwarven craftsmen. Since her father was a smith and her mother a crafter of jewelry, the merchant figured her potentially dexterous hands would be a good fit for what Rudy wanted from her. The thing is, since the merchant never thought that he'd actually be able to sell her, he didn't really bother to maintain her health. So Julie was in a state far worse than what we saw even in the anime. Whereas here you could still distinguish her as a child, both the novel and manga depict her as more of this skeleton. Her eyes were lifeless, her skin pale, and her entire body quivered not because of the cold, but instead because of just how weak it was. It was an abhorrent sight that made Rudy want nothing more than to help her as fast as possible. The only reason he didn't, though, was because her empty eyes didn't seem to indicate that she wanted saving. They were eyes that Rudy was all too familiar with. The circumstances definitely weren't the same, but the despair was enough to know that this girl may want the same thing that he would have wanted back then. And it was for that reason that Rudy asked if she wanted him to end it for her. This next part Rudy never explicitly states, but I assume he's presenting an option that he himself was never given. I mean, he does say how he wanted to die, but unlike how Julie was given a choice here, there was no one around to grant him that same type of mercy. So, knowing all too well the pain of carrying on while no hope existed for the future, I assume he was giving an out that perhaps he may have wanted back when he was in the midst of his peak despair. A dark turn that I honestly wasn't expecting this episode. Episode 31, The Kidnapping and Confinement of Beast Girls, covering chapters 7 and 8 from volume 8 of the light novel. There was actually a whole section left out that gave backstory on both Linnea and Persena. It was a brief history on the beast folk, the Doldia, and how the two of them even ended up at university. I don't expect this to be covered later on, but since this is practically a subchapter in and of itself, here's some minor spoiler warning just in case. Okay, we already know Linnea to be the granddaughter of Gustav and daughter of Gies, but what you may not know is that Persena is not. While Linnea is part of the Dodoldia, Persena actually comes from the Adoldia. She's the granddaughter of the current leader Bulldog and daughter of the next in line Tertelia. Since both tribes are responsible for protecting the Great Forest though, their lineage is practically identical. They're both essentially princesses who will eventually take over as tribal leader. Now, the reason this is so important is because the Doldia have a responsibility tracing back to almost 5,500 years ago. It was in the aftermath of the first Great Human-Demon War where the humans had just won and become quite arrogant because of it. With the beast folk living on land rich with lumber, it was only a matter of time until the humans would invade and try to make that resource their own. So, as numerous tribes and races faced imminent invasion, it was the beast god Geiger who would unite them and lead them. He was a renowned hero that came from the Doldia tribe, one revered as the leader of all beast folk. That being the case, it was even after Geiger had died that the responsibility of protecting the forest would pass on to the Doldia, a duty that's now been carried on for millennia. Nowadays, beast folk were expanding across the world, but with significant influence amongst the elves, dwarves, and hobbits, there was enough military power in the Great Forest alone to fight even Millis. In any case, the point is that Linnea and Persenna are direct descendants of Geiger, two heirs just like how Giaz and Galain were themselves. As for why they were sent here, well, that's because Giaz and Galain were, well, stupid. They were a generation of descendants who turned out to be incredible screw-ups, mainly due to their lack of intelligence. So, in order to prevent that from happening a second time, Gustav ordered Linnea and Persenna to go and study abroad. Perhaps by living in a place where their authority and position had zero meaning, they could come to learn exactly what it meant to have such a thing. But instead of discrimination like how the girls expected, what they received instead was flattery and caution. Flattery from students who were trying to humor them, and caution from teachers too timid to approach them. It was becoming rather apparent that their position as princesses still held weight here. So, what initially started out as them walking around in fear from just the mere sight of humans quickly turned into an ego that made them feel untouchable, especially when they found the unbeatable power of incanted magic combined with vocal magic. By using that with their already elite dexterity and strength, Linnea and Persenna found that they could defeat pretty much anyone, eventually using it to extort, bully, and even blackmail. Then, after a year of doing exactly that, the two had made themselves into the bosses of their own delinquent faction, a group that would terrorize the halls and even claim parts of the school as their territory. What stopped them from taking over the entire school was the arrival of a certain princess from Asura. The teachers who were so eager to serve them were now rapidly flocking to this true princess from a more noble society. Initially, Linnea and Persenna were willing to put up with it, but the more Ariel began to shine with her accomplishments, the more these two started to feel inferior to her. Their resentment only grew as Ariel received praise for being an honor student, then even more so when she joined the student council. When it got to the point where they couldn't take it anymore, that's when they would start to mess with her. First by bumping her shoulder or spitting on the floor next to her, but then by splashing her with water and even stealing her underwear. It was a continued escalation of harassment until Fitz would single-handedly put a stop to it. The plan itself was a trap set up by Ariel, but the showdown was fought and won by Fitz alone. She had defeated all 20 of Linnea and Persenna's goons all by her lonesome, leading to their entire faction getting expelled because of it. The only reason Linnea and Persenna weren't expelled with them was because once again their status had protected them. With no allies left and their social standing in the gutter though, the only place they could vent their rage was in the special classroom, a place where they would unfortunately take it out on Cliff and Zanaba. Aside from that though, there were no moves made towards revenge, and the two were actually attending class in earnest now. It would be a fair statement to say that they were perhaps rehabilitated. Thus the reason why Linnea declared themselves model students during their encounter with Rudius. Now, switching to the actual content of the episode, when we get to the opening scenes with Julie, this whole training montage was supposed to be given from the perspective of Zanaba. He would think to himself just how peculiar Rudius's training methods were, then stare in awe as the results became apparent only a single month later. It was an impressive accomplishment that reassured him of why he'd chosen Rudy as his master. As for his thoughts on Julie, well, he was quite surprised by just how intuitive she was. Not only was she learning the native tongue rather quickly, but she also seemed to understand his orders even if she didn't know all the exact words of them. There were numerous times where she was able to do things correctly both on the first time and without further instruction. Something Zanaba wanted to make sure Julie understood though was just how important it was to value the craft that she was going to be mastering. You see, if she lacked passion for the very art she would be making, then Zanaba knew the whole endeavor would be pointless. If she was gonna make figures the way that he wanted, then he wanted to make sure that she truly understood the magnificence of them. That was the only way to make her shine. When it came to Rudy's inquiry and subsequent revelation next, this would be the first time in which Zanaba would truly see his master angry. Before, he'd only ever seen him respond with dispassionate politeness or self-deprecating deference, but here Rudy's murderous intent was palpable. No longer was he speaking in his usual carefully modulated tones, but was instead tripping over his words as he showcased his profuse fanaticism. Personally, Zanoba didn't care too much for Roxy as a person, but if he was to declare that now in the heat of the moment, then Rudy was sure to murder him without remorse. It didn't matter if he was a blessed child or not, because no amount of supernatural strength was enough to endure the level of magic Rudy would unleash on him. Even his body wasn't that resistant to it. So, with no choice but to tell the truth, that's when we were given the explanation for it all. Linnea and Prasenna had challenged him to a duel, and it was after he lost that the price was Roxy. What the anime doesn't tell us is just how confident Zanoba was going into it. You see, as a blessed child who'd never once been defeated in Shirone, Zanoba had no doubt that he would be able to win against these two. Even if they used anything in the advanced tier or below, he would just grit his teeth and run straight through it. The last thing Zanoba expected, though, was that a strange magic would paralyze him in place, then render him defenseless, leaving him open against a barrage of attacks that would ultimately defeat him. So it was once Rudy had heard that this was the way things played out that his murderous intent would subside for something even more sinister. It was an expression that showed just how important figurines were to him. Initially, his lack of passion made Zanoba think he didn't love them all that much, but after seeing his reaction now, it was clear Rudy's feelings for them were far more fierce than anyone's. So much so that Zanoba was certain Linnea and Prasenna were going to die that day. At first, Zanoba was afraid of what he'd just started, but after realizing the powerful ally that was now at his side, that fear quickly turned to joy knowing revenge was right around the corner. Switching back to Rudy's perspective now, if there was one thing he hated most, it was bullying. Had they stuck to just barking orders, then maybe he could have let that slide since Fitz's intervention had put them in their place already. But it was the desecration of Roxy herself that made him understand why religious incursions happened all throughout history. To him, such a sin was absolutely unforgivable. So, as he planned his method of attack, his experience as an adventurer led him to approach it all calm and collected-like. He wasn't about to overestimate his abilities and end up losing just like how Zanoba did. No, since they had defeated a blessed child 2-on-1, Rudy knew that they were likely very formidable, much to the point that it was safest to consider them as strong as Eris. Now, despite not knowing exactly how strong they were, what he did know was exactly how they were going to attack. One will rapidly charge and use magic to confuse the opponent, while the other would stay behind and immobilize the enemy with vocal magic. They were complementary roles that were also interchangeable between the two of them. It was as Rudy contemplated the best way to confront this that Zanoba would insist such preparations were unnecessary. I mean, to him his master was all-powerful and unassailable. A notion Rudy felt needed correcting since to his knowledge there were at least 4 people stronger than him. The very thought was an immense shock to Zanoba, but with those being only the ones Rudy knew, it was very possible both Linnea and Prasenna could be part of that list as well. Besides, Rudy just wanted this victory to be absolute and flawless, so much so that he was actually willing to recruit both Fitz and Elenalise to fight as well. Since both seemed busy though, a 2-on-2 was the only option available. It was a fight Zanoba wanted to initiate through the proper dueling customs of either Shirone or the Doldia tribe, but was instead disregarded for an ambush since this fight was the farthest thing from a duel. For Rudy it was a bona fide holy war. Now, because the beast folk's senses would reveal any and all surprise attacks, Rudy instead decided to just ambush them. He would scout their path to and from classes, then wait in the optimal position to intercept them. He expected them to skip out on class early, but because Linnea and Prasenna were actually taking them seriously now, Rudy and Zanoba were left standing here for the entire duration. Likely an hour or two of literally standing exactly how they were here. When we get to the actual fight, there isn't really too much to add other than Rudy wanting to negate Prasenna's vocal magic with his disturb magic. Ideally that would have been the optimal move to counter her, but because he had no idea how that magic worked or even how the mana behind it flowed, he wasn't certain disturb magic would even work here. His demon eye was certainly helpful for dealing with Linnea, but with movements as sloppy as hers, a handicap like that wasn't even necessary. Her attack was a stark contrast from what he would have expected if dealing with Eris. She would have charged straight towards him, never even let herself get hit by his counter, then in the off chance that she did get knocked down, she would have grabbed his leg here and snapped his tibia. Of course, Rudy would have responded differently as well, but the point was that far more skilled fighters would have lasted longer. Sure, Eris does have experience fighting Rudy personally, but someone like Paul was able to counter his quagmire instantly, even after having never seen it before. So, either Linnea and Persenna were actually quite weak, or Paul and Eris were actually incredibly strong. He wasn't sure considering all the extremely powerful people he'd fought up until now. In any case, the whole captivity scene after this was pretty much as we saw. There was a bit of additional back and forth between Linnea and Persenna, but the only thing worth noting was their account of how Zanaba stayed late into the night trying to collect every shattered piece of the Roxy figure. It didn't matter how small it was, because Zanaba wasn't going to leave behind even a single fragment. It was an act of respect that filled Rudy's heart with affection for him. This, combined with the fact that the figure was easily fixable, had subsided his rage just a little bit, but not enough to let them go since they didn't quite seem remorseful enough. Sure, they were apologetic for desecrating someone's god, but they didn't seem the same for destroying another person's precious property. Enough that if Rudy was to let them go now, he was certain they would just end up doing it again one day. So, in order to prevent that from happening, Rudy would ask Zanaba what he thought a fitting punishment was. Initially, he wanted to smash them the same way they did to Roxy, but since killing them was definitely out of the question, he instead settled on selling them as slaves to the Asura Kingdom. He'd heard they had an intense love for beastfolk there and was content with breaking an international treaty to do so. Sure, the very act would likely start a war between Shirane and the beastfolk, but to Zanaba that was a small price to pay if it meant getting his revenge. He had zero consideration for self-preservation, unlike how Rudy did. So, with those not being very practical, the only other option was to ask Fitz, leading to that whole discussion in the library. This wasn't shown in the anime, but the way Rudy had justified his actions was by saying he was friends with the tribal chief. It was a segue into the whole story about how he'd ended up befriending them. Yet another tale showcasing just how amazing he was to her. Now, if you're wondering why Linnea and Persenna ended up the way that they did here, well, in addition to the hunger which had become unbearable, their enhanced senses made being trapped in a dorm filled with men absolute torture. Reason being that the intent of those around them was so incredibly potent that every footstep they heard had made them fear it was the end of them. So it wasn't just a lack of sustenance that made them fold, but also a constant state of fear lasting almost 24 hours. It was more than enough time to convince them to become Rudy's followers. In case they did start to rebel again though, the paint Fitz applied read that they were a dog and cat who had lost to Rudius. They only had to keep that for a single day, but the paint on their backs would have to stay for a little bit longer. There were several embarrassing statements Fitz wrote which she mentioned would remain for 6 months, kind of like an extra layer of caution for them. Episode 32, The Fiancé of Despair, covering chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 from Volume 9 of the light novel. As I said in the intro, since the episode is distinctly split between Cliff's proposal and the whole Beastfolk mating season, for this video we'll focus solely on the latter chapters, the part of the story where Rudius literally disintegrates a Demon King. Half a year after Rudy had enrolled, we stumble across a period of time known as the Harvest Season. It wasn't a season that lasted very long, but for the short time it did, the events that occurred during were very important. One of which was of course the Beastfolk mating rituals. With only 5% of the student body actually being beastfolk though, you wouldn't think 500 of them would become so prominent, yet it was once autumn came that you couldn't go 5 steps without seeing one. Reason being that, despite their small number, beastfolk from around the world would gather and increase it tenfold. There were numerous students for which beastfolk would travel far and wide to challenge here. Lots of ideal marriage candidates just like Linnea and Persenna. The school wasn't necessarily fond of outsiders walking in whenever they wanted, but since the mating season was a very delicate subject inherent to the beastfolk culture, to ban such a tradition would undoubtedly incite riots. It was a lot easier to just let those non-student beastfolk in under the pretense of auditing classes. Of course, granted they asked for permission first. So, what does that have to do with the overall story? Well, with Linnea and Persenna being these unattainable princesses as well as the strongest beastfolk fighters in the entire school, to beat them would make you a potential candidate to lead all the Doldia. There was a good chance that making them your mate would result in you being heavily considered to lead the tribe one day. That said, all this was something neither of them were concerned with. So normally any proposals would just be rejected outright, but it seems the more they resisted, the more suitors they attracted. It eventually got to the point where beastmen would ambush them and try to win their affection by force. Luckily, no one was ever strong enough, but the constant attacks were enough of a bother to make the two hold themselves up all season. They would much rather stay inside than deal with the hassle of it all. For everyone else who wasn't beast folk, additional caution was needed since many people liked to take advantage of all the chaos. So much so that the school had to deploy security patrols and ensure all duels were fully consensual. The general rule being that you couldn't attack someone who refused to fight you. Unfortunately, that didn't always work though, so for those who weren't quite skilled in self-defense, the professors insisted that they travel in groups. There were even times when some would be challenged under the precedent that it was just for practice. So, if any girls were to come up and try to do that to Rudius, Fitz had told him to just ignore them. 9 times out of 10, they were likely just trying to trick him. In any case, this whole mating season thing was now a core part of the university's curriculum. It was an abrupt change to Rudy's otherwise peaceful student life. Where things start to pick up is that initial challenge from the Beastman we see here. It wasn't the challenger that was so much of interest to him though, but instead the female bystander standing next to him. Nothing was said of note other than a description of her appearance, but her sword was mentioned to be one commonly used by practitioners of the sword god style. Aside from that, she was simply there as a bystander to the other challenger. To Rudy, she was likely just a passerby. Now, Rudy had tried to reject the duel by saying he was late for piano practice, but just as we saw, this Adoldian was intent on fighting. Not only was he aware that Rudy had slain a stray worm solo, but Gaius himself had told him just how exceptional Rudy was. To Brooke, Rudy was the perfect opponent. Just as quickly as it was in the anime though, Rudy had trapped Brooke with a sneaky quagmire, then immediately ended the duel with a single stone cannon. It was a fight that Rudy had essentially won on reflex. With 5 more challenges coming shortly after, Rudy had finally understood what Linnea and Prasenna meant with the letter they had sent. It seems more than a few people were infatuated by the fact that they were princesses, leaving Rudy no choice but to hole himself up in the library. Whether it was a university rule or an ancient beastfolk tradition, for some reason the beastfolk weren't so blunt as to challenge him here. So, as they waited in line outside, it was Rudy's discussion with Fitz that would lead him to take the initiative and finally fight them. To her, it was easier to just defeat them than wait for them to leave. She didn't even think he'd need any help despite aid from the student council being a valid option for him. So, it was when Rudy did finally accept his fate that he would come across a single challenger rather than the multiple he was expecting. An immortal demon king that went by the name of Bodigadi. If you're wondering how Bodigadi got here, well, that's a whole side story from part of the epilogue of last volume. You see, it was 3 months prior to this very encounter that we find ourselves in a small bit of land called Ogre Island. A place inhabited solely by the Ogre tribe and led by a strong warrior that's often referred to as the Ogre God. Technically, these ogres are part of the demon race, but since they never fought in the Laplace War or even the Great Human Demon War, they were never fully ingrained as part of it. Instead, the ogres became considered a race of their own, much like how we consider the dwarves and elves as such. Since these ogres liked to keep to themselves though, it was very rare for anyone to even know of their existence. Their only friendly relation was with the Behirul kingdom just west of them, and any person unlucky enough to stumble into their territory was immediately attacked and subsequently killed. That usually was the way visitors were treated, but it wasn't until a mysterious man had arrived by ship that his curiosity would surpass even their reclusive nature. At first, the ogres did put up a little bit of a fuss, but after a bit of time this man was eventually welcomed as their guest. He would settle down and become their friend, and even train their youth and befriend the ogre god. It was a comfortable way of living that would last for around 2 years or so. That may seem long to us, but for a man who'd lived for over thousands, such a period was actually quite brief for him, especially with the arrival of a certain letter making his departure immediate. What this letter was a response from an S-ranked adventurer with whom he'd issued an urgent request to. She had apparently found the person he'd been looking for all the way back before he'd even arrived at Ogre Island. So, once that message was made clear, this man knew that he'd have to leave immediately. Human lives were far too short to get caught up enjoying his stay too long. That's just how brief several decades were to him. So, after a grand banquet held by the ogres, this man who had made himself a guest would be sent off by the solitary tribe that had welcomed him. He was this immortal man that once fought with the ogre god only to lose, reviving the next day only to lose once more. Then, after repeating this cycle over and over, well, let's just say that those 2 years weren't quite long enough. It's a story about Bodigadi that was briefly shown in the end credits for episode 4. Now, the journey this demon king took next takes us all the way to the west to the farthest ends of the northern territories. It was along his journey there, though, that every country he would cross through would treat him a little bit differently. One would see his arrival as an invasion, while another would attempt to appease him by offering sacrifices. Regardless of what it was, this immortal demon would continue forward without any hesitation. He would ignore any and all attempts to stop him and continue west in a straight line just like the Juggernaut from X-Men. Then, by the time a country would even realize he was there, he would already be gone and into the next. There was no stopping Bodigadi until he got to Renoa. It was once he finally did get there that the word of his approach would bring about panic and confusion. You see, normally such news would be passed far faster than the Demon King's arrival, but by the time the higher-ups heard that he was coming, Bodigadi had already crossed into their territory. It was a sudden invasion that they were neither prepared for nor expecting. Part of the reason why it was such a surprise was mainly because Demon Kings never ventured off the Demon Continent anymore. Sure, in the past there were several warlike aggressive ones who were always invading, but after the Laplace War all those hundreds of years ago, most, if not all, were completely exterminated. The only Demon Kings that remained now were the ones that were peaceful or cautious by nature. They were the ones that ruled the Demon Continent in peace. That's not to say that they were weak though, because each of these kings were more than strong enough to conquer parts of the Demon Continent single-handedly. So if just one got up and decided to attack the humans one day, the amount of damage they could do would be unfathomable. That being the case, it was only natural the Northern Territories tried to intercept him, not only by dispatching every single one of their knights, but by also requesting emergency assistance from the Adventurers Guild. It was a massive force that unfortunately was still quite a ways away from the university. A mini garrison was positioned around campus, but with that being only local adventurers, members of the Magic Guild, and small units of soldiers, at best they could only hope to slow down Bodigadi. It was an order that would only be given if the situation seemed necessary. Until then, the garrison was ordered to wait for the main forces. Now, from the perspective of those being invaded, the Demon King's purpose could have been anything. There was no telling what he wanted or who he was after. All they knew was that now he was here in the university. As for who it was they were facing, well, since there was only one Demon King with 6 arms and that color skin, everyone immediately knew it was Bodigadi the Immortal, the ancient king whose power was literal indestructibility. He was a demon that lived since before the Laplace War and was even thought to have fought against the demon god himself and survived. Since he was typically peaceful by nature though, no one ever knew what his full capabilities were. All they knew for certain was that he could survive literally anything. So, why was this Demon King here now? Well, the only thing we know is that he was here for Rudius, bringing us now back to when Rudy would be staring him down in the school's courtyard. Rudy had started to feel a bit more powerful lately, but considering the giant tank standing in front of him, he felt this was probably the universe setting him straight again. So it was as he was waiting for his staff that the principal George would run from the crowd and tell Rudy that reinforcements were coming. All they needed was for Rudy to buy them a little bit more time. This wasn't something included in the anime because if they did, then they would have to include everything that preceded it. They would need to explain why it is Bodigadi being here was such a crisis for them. So, as one of the more major bits of cut content, we're missing a whole layer of context which would have made the situation a lot more tense. The entire nation was supposed to be in a state of panic and the school was supposed to be doing everything they could to delay Bodigadi from going any further. They had even gone so far as to hold Fitz back from delivering Rudy's staff to him. If they could prevent him from receiving his staff, then to them they felt that they could delay the duel forever. That was the reason Fitz had taken so long to deliver it to him. It wasn't until Zaniba stepped in to help Fitz that she was finally able to break free and get to him. Yet another bit of cut content showing just how chaotic the situation was. In any case, an interesting thing to note from right before the duel is that Rudy had actually tried to activate his Eye of Foresight. He wanted to see if there was any particular attack Bodigadi was going to lead into first. What he saw instead, though, was absolutely nothing as the Demon King standing there was no longer visible to him. Apparently, demon eyes didn't work on him. Another important bit of context was the brief back and forth the two had right after Rudy had mentioned Orsted. First, Bodigadi wanted to know if it really was Orsted, then after that he asked Rudy if he was able to injure him. It was only after Rudy had answered yes that Bodigadi would straighten up and proceed to the request we saw. He wanted Rudy to hit him with his best, perhaps even the same spell he used against Orsted. The reasoning wasn't quite clear, but given that he was curious on whether Rudy was able to injure Orsted or not, perhaps Bodigadi wanted to see whose battle aura was stronger. When it came to the attack itself, the most important component out of this 3-step process was actually the amount of mana put into the velocity. If nothing else, this was the part Rudy would devote the most mana into. Considering the time he had to focus on all 3 though, Rudy was hoping he would at least be able to scratch the Demon King. So you can imagine his surprise when he literally obliterated him. The moment the stone cannon reached his body, everything above the waist and arms were all instantly disintegrated. They had immediately disappeared as if not even there to begin with. It was an odd sight made even more peculiar by the fact that there wasn't blood. Perhaps an indication that that was just how things worked with the Demon King. Regardless, with that the battle was over and Rudy the victor. Had the two fought for real, then Bodigadi was certain the entire campus would be reduced to rubble. So to him it was wise for Rudy to have chosen this type of battle. It was after Rudy was knocked out for winning that Bodigadi would then go and willingly discuss things with the principal. It was them, the leader of the Magic Guild and the captain of the Magic Knights, who would work things out to eventually make him a student here. That entire process took about a month, but it was after all that he would come to stick around for a bit. In the meantime, Rudy would do more slice-of-life stuff with Fitz and his classmates. Minor things that I'll mention in the next episode. Episode 33, The White Mask, covering chapters 5 and 6 from volume 9 of the light novel. Starting things off in the library, there was a bit more to why Rudy thought teleportation was similar to summoning magic. Not only were the magic circles for both very much alike, but the color of the magical energy emitted when both were activated were almost identical to each other too. It seemed the only difference was that one could transport humans while the other couldn't. No matter how much Rudy scoured through records, myths, ancient histories, and legends, not a single one included a reference to a person being summoned. It was as if this was a rule that applied to all races and people equally. This didn't really pertain to his research involving the displacement incident, but something about it just made Rudy curious. You see, sure you couldn't summon a person with all their flesh and blood, but what about if it was just their soul? What if you could summon the spirit of a person who was dead? This wasn't something Rudy was dying to figure out, but if he did ever get the opportunity to meet an expert in summoning, then the possibility of doing that was something he'd definitely inquire to them. It was a question that would have to wait since no professor in the school had even the slightest specialization in summoning. There were a few members in the Magicians Guild who could cast beginner and intermediate magic for it, but with simple familiars and mindless spirits being the only things they could conjure, they weren't quite the people Rudy was looking for. It was as if the entire field just wasn't well developed. In fact, out of all the people Rudy had met in his entire life, there was only one he could remember that had even a little bit of skill in summoning. He couldn't quite remember who it was, but he was sure if he ran into them again then he would remember. In any case, with that being the core limitation behind Rudy's research, there wasn't more he could do until Fitz had come forth with another way forward. It was after she'd asked the principal and vice principal that she was able to find out that there actually was someone in the guild who was studying summoning magic. An A-ranked member that went by the name of Silent 7-Star, a special student just like Rudius. If you're wondering what being an A-ranked member of the guild means, well, it's essentially the equivalent of being a branch manager. An S rank makes you part of the central leadership group, while the B rank naturally places you below both. That's not to say it doesn't still come with perks, because if any of these people were to start up a school for magicians, the guild would offer financial and logistical support no matter where they were. It was a pretty fleshed out hierarchy whose benefits Silent seemed to be taking advantage of. As for how she got that rank, well, that would be due to all her contributions to the school. First, she improved the menu by adding a curry lookalike called Curry Soup. Then she improved the public image by introducing uniforms. By leveraging connections she had with designers and manufacturers in Asura, apparently she had created her own supply line and distribution systems to make all of it happen, resulting in a more tasty dining menu, along with a student body that looked more like this unified group with a single purpose. It was a stark difference from the previous image of a chaotic mixture of all tribes and races. Aside from those, there were also plenty of other subtle innovations attributed to her, minor things that were all very familiar. Sure, they were definitely new inventions here, but to Rudy this was something he'd been suspicious about for a while now. To him, Silent was a person whose origins were already apparent. The reason he'd never acted upon it until now, though, was because the very idea of someone like him existing was just incredibly frightening. So whether it was wanting to believe that he alone was special, or the potential of being judged by someone who was given the same advantages as him, a person like Silent, like him, was someone he was trying to avoid. He was afraid they would view all the time he'd spent as wasted. afraid that they would take their own success, compare it to what he had done, then ask why he didn't do more. So, it wasn't so much the idea of not being the only isekai person that scared him, but instead the idea that that person would criticize the way he's lived so far. To hear he didn't do enough would just be devastating, especially from a person who'd been given the same advantages yet made significantly better use of them. That was the way that Rudy felt about it. It was only after he'd considered everything he'd done so far, though, that Rudy felt he could finally face her. In fact, he'd actually started to feel a bit cocky himself these days. So, if there was anything this silent person was going to look down on him for, it certainly wasn't going to be for anything he'd done while at the university. Now, when we get to the actual encounter with her, this whole display of trauma was exactly how the novel described it as. It was an incredibly accurate portrayal that depicted Rudy's PTSD perfectly. The only things worth adding are the thoughts that Rudy had while it was happening. There was a severe disconnect between what he wanted to do and what was actually happening. The legs he'd trained for moments exactly like this were running as fast as they could but only moved like they were in a dream. At first he thought Silent was just really fast, but it was moments later that he realized it was actually him that was just slow, leading to his inevitable tumble down the stairs. In the next scene where Fitz is asking Silent questions, there was a certain hostility from her that I think the anime failed to capture here. You see, rather than be mostly timid like how we saw, Fitz was both audibly and visibly aggressive. She was very clearly upset by the fact that Rudy was upset. Now, for this next part where Nanahoshi explains everything to Rudy, I believe it's very important to analyze everything. In a conversation like this, I think every detail matters. So, in addition to Silent mentioning how she didn't expect to meet Rudy here, she also used some peculiar wording in her next sentence. She spoke as if them meeting here together was fated, the nature of this route as determined by a flag set during their prior encounter all those years ago. This could just be a reference to common language used in visual novels or dating sims, but for a character that doesn't seem very much interested in that, I wouldn't expect her to be quite familiar with such. A quick distinction that needs to be made with one of Nanahoshi's responses to Fitz is the use of the word homeland instead of place here. Place implies that the two of them could have met anywhere, while homeland to Fitz means Fatoa. It's a minor change that makes Sylphie's reaction all the more understandable. Now, it was after Nanahoshi revealed herself to be Japanese that confusion swirled through Rudy's mind as he tried to make sense of it all. He couldn't understand how 15 years had passed, yet she looked exactly the same. I mean, if she had reincarnated just like him, then there was no way her body and face would be the same way he remembered it. It was because it was, though, that Rudy realized her situation was entirely different. To him, the only explanation was that she had somehow warped here. It was in the time it took for Rudy to come to that conclusion that Nanahoshi would speed through several more questions, sometimes mixing in subtle remarks hinting at just how much she hated this world. These comments did rub Rudy the wrong way, but as someone who knew what it was like to despise the world around him, he completely understood the sentiment of it. So, despite Nanahoshi calling this world tedious and ridiculous, it was a point of view she had every right to possess. There was no need to try and change or correct that, since Rudy understood where exactly it was coming from. He definitely could have worded his opposition to it a little bit better, but when asked to help find a way back, just the suggestion of the idea was enough to get a strong reaction out of him. He couldn't help but knock her hand away and immediately tell her that he never wanted to go back. It was a much more abrupt response than what we got in the anime, one that explains why Silent became so cautious of him after. Had he just accepted her request, then politely disagreed with her sentiment after, then that definitely would have made getting answers a lot more easy. But it was because he made a scene and had such a knee-jerk reaction that Nanahoshi would become a lot more wary of him. It was a natural response considering their priorities were direct opposite to each other. Now, Rudy wasn't so open to sharing details about his past life, but he was definitely okay with sharing stuff about his current one. He had opened up about how he'd been reborn and started his new life here, even mentioning how he'd died in an accident, but leaving out any details that could lead her to finding out what he really looked like. He felt revealing that would just make her think less of him. Appearances aside though, there was also the chance that she could blame him for her being here. So, in the off chance that that did happen, Rudy didn't want to be hunted by her. It was in Nanahoshi's explanation of how she got here next that we get to the largest bits of cut content from the episode. Specifics that provide a lot more insight into both her circumstances and the teleportation incident. So, starting with the moment of her arrival, the place she appeared was essentially ground zero. It was the middle of an open field where nothing was around her and nobody was in sight. a place we can only assume is the very location the displacement incident originated from. It was a little bit later after this that Orsted would be the first to find her and take her under his protection, leading her on a journey all throughout Asura where she would eventually learn the language, the basics of magic, the economic system, and finally the people's lifestyles. It was a similar way of learning to the one that Rudy had taken. The only difference between her and him, though, was that in the years that it took Rudy to learn all that, Nanahoshi had done it in one, likely because of how important it was. Rudy figured that if you're traveling with a person who's cursed to be hated by everyone, it was probably best to learn how to do your own talking. So, in the 2 years Nanahoshi had spent in Asura, she would manage to turn herself into quite the prominent businesswoman. She would earn money with her knowledge of Japanese cuisine and clothing, spend that money to obtain power, then use that power to make even more money, eventually securing herself several reliable streams of passive income. This wouldn't be that easy for the average person, but Nanahoshi had made sure to leverage Orsted's Dragon God title to the fullest. You see, just a single letter signed by him was enough to get meetings with pretty much anyone. Whether it be powerful merchants, famous mages, or even monarchs, any and all would come to the table if Orsted was the one who had made it for them. So it was once Nanahoshi was in the room with them that she would then use skillful negotiation to get what she wanted. For the cases involving her time in Asura, she had convinced some top merchants to arrange stable distribution routes for all her products, after which the money they would bring in would be enough to let her live the rest of her life in luxury. Of course, none of that really mattered to her since from the very beginning they were all stepping stones to find a way back home. So it was once that knowledge was gained and fortune made that Nanahoshi would leave Asura and travel with Orsted, venturing around the world in hopes of finding information on how to get out of here. That or anything of the two friends that could have been sent here with her. This duo would come across many fights as expected, but the single one that stood out was the one with Rudy. She couldn't say why Orsted hated the man god so much, but apparently his experience with him led him to the conclusion that it was always best to take out his apostles quickly. To let them go usually meant quite a bit of trouble later for him. Since Rudy knew he wasn't even one of these apostles though, he didn't really like the fact that he'd been murdered because of it. I mean, to him this wasn't even a feud that he was part of. So, to lose his life over what was at best a misunderstanding was something Rudy wasn't quite ready to get over just yet. Now, one of the peculiar things Rudy found about Nanahoshi's story was the way that she was able to travel the world in only a year. Since his journey had taken somewhere around 3, it didn't really make sense for hers to be done in 1. No natural method would have allowed her to complete it that fast. So, it was after Rudy inquired into it that Nanahoshi would explain that it was with the help of teleportation circles, warping devices long thought to be destroyed several centuries ago. According to Nanahoshi though, there were actually quite a few that survived intact deep in the ruins that date back to the Human-Demon War. So rather than walk from country to country, Orsted and Nanahoshi had instead gone from circle to circle, visiting whatever countries were on the path between one and the next. Rudy did ask where he could potentially find these ruins, but even if Nanahoshi knew, she wouldn't have said since Orsted had asked her to keep it a secret. Apparently, teleportation was a forbidden magic that not too many people should know about, something Orsted didn't want Nanahoshi talking about carelessly. Another secret Nanahoshi was told to keep was the identity of the person who suggested that she was summoned here. It was someone who was well known to be a world-class authority on summoning magic. They didn't want Nanahoshi saying that she had met them though, since if she did, she would apparently be swarmed by greedy, power-hungry jackals. People who likely wanted to gain an audience with this mystery person themselves. Despite this person being such an expert though, even they didn't know how it was possible to summon a human like this. Like, even if they set aside the whole another world thing, just the idea of summoning a living person was theoretically impossible. Even so, with this being the only lead for Nanahoshi to work with, she decided it was best to pursue it at the Renoa University of Magic. She would be recommended as a student by Orsted, provide an enormous donation straight to the guild, then use her expansive network and modern-day knowledge to improve the schooling system. It was a series of contributions that would jump her straight to the A rank. The guild had even offered her an S rank, but that was under the condition that she share all her knowledge. An offer I'm sure you're not surprised to hear she declined. Once again, the reasoning being that she wasn't interested in reforming this world for the better. She wasn't even concerned with improving her status. To her, the only thing that mattered was getting home. Now, though the anime makes it seem like getting erased is an actual possibility, the novels made it clear that this was all just speculation. There was no concrete evidence to support her claim, and the claims itself were just based off of science fiction novels. In any case, it was after Nanahoshi had secured her research facility that she would then devote herself to the study of summoning magic. It was a field whose foundation was heavily based on magic circles. From what she'd discovered so far, to create a magic circle you needed magic crystals and various ingredients to combine them with. The crystals would then be crushed and mixed with the ingredients, then the resulting paint would be used to draw patterns. Mana would then be pumped into the paint, and a certain magic effect would be produced depending on whatever patterns were drawn, after which the paint would evaporate and a new circle would have to be made. Where these magic circles start to get a bit tricky is with the variety of ingredients that change depending on the nature of the spell you're casting. So while you can theoretically cast any spell with a magic circle, certain powerful ones like those at the king tier and above start to require some very unusual catalysts for them, like super rare items that require the financial support of a country to find. With that and the patterns being the core tenets of her research, they were all things that Nanahoshi had become quite the expert in. I'm not going to go into the specifics of why that is, but just know that after extensive experimentation, eventually she was able to come up with brand new magic circles of her own, a feat that many thought to be just straight up impossible these days. It was an impressive discovery that made even Rudy curious, one she unfortunately wasn't willing to share cause I'm sure you can only imagine the amount of time and research that was put into it. If Rudy helped her with her experiments though, that and any other knowledge she would be happy to give. Even if he had questions she didn't have answers to, so long as Rudy provided his world-class mana to help, Nanahoshi promised she would even use her connections to help answer them. She did after all know quite a few influential people, so it was a pretty fair offer that was beneficial to the both of them. Now, when we get to their discussion of the incident itself, while both the outburst and explanation were accurate, I'll just simplify what it is Nanahoshi was trying to say here. Whatever it was that brought her into this world, the displacement incident was likely a side effect of it. Since she was summoned here the moment everyone else was teleported, it only made sense that the two were correlated to each other. She couldn't say much else about why it happened, who had done it, or what their intentions were, but what she did know was that she was summoned here because of it. Even when she had asked Orsted about it, his only answer was that it was unprecedented. So if a so-called god wasn't able to figure it out, then there was probably no chance Rudy or Nanahoshi could either. There was a time when the man god had said that it was Orsted's fault, but Rudy wasn't so naive as to just blindly believe that. No, instead he attributed that blame to the curse which had made everyone hate Orsted. Perhaps Hitogami was under its effects too. That or he was just blaming him because of their feud with each other. Either way, the truth of the displacement incident would have to remain a mystery for now. So, that was pretty much it for what was mentioned in the episode, but now that we know what we know about the teleportation incident, there is some cut content I feel needs mentioning from when it happened. You see, back in Season 1 when everyone was noticing it for the first time, there were 3 people who kind of shared a bit more insight on it. Orsted saw the mana pooling as madness and immediately decided to go investigate. Kashirika's demon eyes should have been able to see who was controlling it, but the fact that she couldn't meant that she could only deduce that it was summoning magic. Then the armored dragon Perugius, who deemed the light as a summoning too, determined the level of it to be far greater than anything he'd seen before. If anything, it was similar to when they had created Chaos Breaker, that being the epic name for the floating castle they're in. They don't explain much more than that, but based on what they said regarding Chaos Breaker and the Light of Summoning, I can only imagine that perhaps this floating castle was summoned into this world too. An incredible feat that likely required an absurd amount of mana just like how Nanahoshi's summoning did. If you've ever wondered how it is someone like Eris could fight the way that she does, well, the answer to that is simply Battle Aura. It's a term I'm sure you've heard at least once or twice before, but given that the anime doesn't really talk about it, it may be something you're not quite familiar with. Now, you may be wondering what this has to do with a day-in-the-life episode such as this, but you'd be surprised to know that Battle Aura wasn't the only world-building topic omitted from it. There was also Rudius's new official rank, a lot of new interesting details on magic, then even an apparent connection of curses to gods. So, if any of that piques your curiosity, then stick around as we take a look at what the anime left out from the novels. Episode 34, These Feelings, covering chapters 7 and 8 from volume 9 of the light novel. With the first half of the episode being more of a day in the life, we'll start things off with Rudy's morning routine. A year had passed since he'd enrolled, and though he didn't know for sure, he was fairly confident his birthday was just recently. This wasn't really all that important though, since in this world, only every 5th birthday was celebrated. So, with today being one just like any other, Rudy would kick things off with his usual training session, a workout and run that was then followed up by sword drills. Normally this would be done by himself, but ever since Bodyguardi joined the school and became a student, there were numerous times where he would just stand there and watch. Like, literally stare, remain silent, and nod his head from time to time. With regards to the scene we got in the anime, this would be one of those rare occasions where Bodyguardi would actually say something. And it's the ensuing conversation with Rudy after that brings us to a topic that's actually quite important. So, before Bodyguardi had even asked why Rudius wanted strength, he first asked if there was any point to him pursuing it. You see, to him a person with so much mana didn't need to. He was confused why Rudy would even attempt to train without first cloaking himself in battle aura. This may very well be a term you've never actually heard before, but for Rudy it was yet another of the countless times that it had been mentioned to him. The thing is, since no one ever went on to explain it, Rudy felt this was the perfect time to finally ask about it. It was a simple inquiry that would lead to just as simple of an answer. When you break it down to its most fundamental level, battle aura was simply mana. It was a technique that used mana to dramatically increase the body's physical capabilities, often strengthening it to unnatural extremes. Ever wonder how Eris was able to cut that snake in half? Well, that would be with the help of battle aura. As for how it worked, the general idea was that a field of mana was created, spread all over the body, then pressed tightly to it. I'm sure that doesn't sound too challenging technically, but for some reason, no matter how Rudy manipulated his mana, he could never feel this massive change in strength like how he was supposed to. He tried imitating Super Saiyans and Nen users, but as Bodyguardi himself had said, he simply didn't have the talent for it. It was supposed to be this natural byproduct of extensive physical training, but even with Rudy's multiple years doing such, nothing at all seemed to be coming from it. It made him think that perhaps it just wasn't possible for him. Perhaps he just couldn't generate battle aura the same way everyone else did. As surprising as this was, it wasn't unheard of for people to not be capable of battle aura at all. They could be doing the most intense training in the world and still battle aura would fail to manifest around them. So it was very plausible that this was what was happening to Rudy here. It's not like any of this really mattered though, since the last person with as much mana as Rudy chose not to cloak himself in battle aura either. It was yet another comparison of Rudius to Laplace, an increasingly common occurrence when it came to any conversation with Bodyguardi. The reason why this is because Bodyguardi was actually one of the few to have met Laplace and lived. He annihilated Body's body with a single blow, but even that wasn't enough to surpass Body's immortality. So it was from that brief encounter that Bodyguardi was able to understand two things about Laplace. The first was that he was an extremely shady character, and the second was that his control over mana was perfect. If there was anything to note about Laplace other than his levels of mana, it was his complete and utter mastery over how to use it. Naturally, this made Rudy curious if he could learn how to fight like that too, but according to Bodyguardi, it simply wasn't possible. You see, if there was ever a time where Rudy tried to use mana the same way Laplace did, he would simply implode from the overload of mana being channeled within him. It seems Rudy's body wasn't built to support all the mana he was gifted with. So, much like how Deku couldn't support One for All because of how weak his body was, so too is Rudy incapable of using his 100%. He can never reach the true potential his mana should allow him to because, unlike Laplace, his body will never be as sturdy. No amount of training would change the fact that he's just this frail human who shouldn't even have this much mana in the first place. With that making Rudy's limitations clear, Bodyguardi would then go on to ask the question from the anime. For what reason did he want to become stronger? There wasn't much more to it than what we got, so the next part of Rudy's day would be his classes. The first of which was Intermediate Detoxification Magic. As a branch of healing that cured ailments and purged poisons, this was the class Rudy hoped would solve his impotence. The thing is, the rarer the illness and more potent the poison, the more advanced of a spell you needed to cure it. You also needed a specific incantation for each individual poison and ailment. So, with this being a magic Rudy couldn't cast silently, that meant there was an extensive amount of memorization involved for it. Even more so once you got into the higher ranks. Like, for incantations just at the intermediate level, most if not all were phrases several times longer than anything used in offensive magic. Combine that with the fact that there were at least 50 of them, and what you get is a tedious field of pure monotony. It's when you get to the advanced tier that not only are the number of incantations doubled, but so too is the length and the amount of mana required to cast it. The Saint tier fortunately doesn't require much more memorization than before, but the amount of mana once again increases even further. Once you get to the King tier, that's when we start talking about spells created by their own nation-funded research programs. Highly potent poisons and antidotes that are guarded as state secrets after. Usually it's one nation that creates a poison incurable by any other magic, then another nation that has to respond by finding an antidote for it. So this back and forth is kinda like an arms race but with detoxification magic, something that definitely skirts the lines of the Geneva Protocol. Aside from that, for anyone who's unlucky enough to have read an incantation at the King tier, it's likely they'll be reciting the contents of an entire book, at which point whoever's waiting to get healed will probably be dead by the time it's finished. Then, at the final rank of Divine, the only known use of detoxification magic here was for a spell that cured a disease called Petrification Syndrome. It's a rare illness that transforms the mana inside a person's body to stone. Only one person had ever been able to cure this, and the incantation for it is guarded carefully at the Great Cathedral of Milishon. In any case, this was the specifics of detoxification magic as Rudy had learned it. There wasn't anything helpful for curing his impotence, but what he did learn was that if he ever wanted to specialize in it, it was probably best to just carry a book with him. It was once this class was over that lunch would be next and we would get to the scene with Bodygotti, Julie, and alcohol. For those who were wondering, no, this isn't something the school serves regularly. Yes, it was taken from the principal, and no, Rudy didn't approve of Julie drinking it. It wasn't his place to step in and say otherwise though, since only he thought that she was too young for it. The next period brings us to Rudy's advanced healing class, where surprisingly only Persenna was part of it. Apparently Linnea had enrolled herself into a different course. Persenna was a lot more studious, so while she was actively learning in her classes, Linnea on the other hand was struggling. She couldn't quite grasp the fundamentals of elemental magic. Of course, that required a basic understanding of elementary level science, but no matter how simply Rudy tried explaining things to her, she just wasn't able to grasp the foundations of it. The core principles of things like evaporation and condensation didn't seem like they were clicking with her. Now, while we are on the topic of elemental magic, it turns out Rudy had just recently passed his test to become a Saint-level Earth Magician. It was a test that required the casting of the Saint tier spell Sandstorm, a fierce torrent of sand and wind that was devastating to anyone caught within it. Not only did it make the entire area impossible to see through, but just breathing became tough as massive piles of shifting sand raged through the air. So if Cumulonimbus tested for the manipulation of rain clouds and wind currents, then Sandstorm was the test of one's ability to control massive quantities of tiny particles. With this bringing Rudy to the Saint tier in a second element, he was actually becoming more interested in doing the same for the other two. So if there was ever a chance that he could track down the professors who taught them, then he figured he might as well get the Saint rank for all of them. An interesting thing that you should know though is that despite Rudy only being formally recognized as Saint level, his silent spellcasting is currently more on the King level, at least as dictated by Bodygotti anyway. Since only King tier spells and above could penetrate his battle aura, Rudy was surprised to hear that his stone cannon's destructive power was at the Emperor level. He wasn't sure if that meant he could call himself an Emperor-level magician though, since when he asked the professor if he could, they responded in a snide way saying he could call himself whatever he wanted. It was a snarky remark that probably stemmed from their jealousy of him. So, in hopes of not getting on the professor's bad side, Rudy just kept his titles the way they were. To him, there was no merit in advertising himself as better. Fast forward to the early afternoon, and that's when we get to Rudy's part-time job with Nanahoshi. Now that she finally had an infinite source of mana, she was no longer restraining herself from all the experiments she wanted to do. Before, she only had a finite supply of magic crystals, but now any and every magic circle was being tested. It didn't matter whether she expected the circle to fail or succeed. If it was drawn up and fully made, she wanted it tested. So, as the number of circles went from the hundreds to thousands, it was clear that Nanahoshi would make and test as many as were necessary. It was as Rudy was warning her not to get carried away that Nanahoshi would respond with something peculiar. You see, Rudy was just trying to warn her not to recreate the displacement incident, but rather than agree, Nanahoshi instead deflected into an excuse. She responded as if messing up was inevitable. That's not to say she was purposefully trying to recreate the displacement incident, but it seems returning home may be taking precedence over safety. Regardless, it was clear Nanahoshi was slowly working towards something. She couldn't tell Rudy what it was, but at the very least, there was a plan here. Now, given how these summoning sessions had been going on for some time, There were actually days when Sylphie would show up and join him. Her involvement didn't last very long though, as the whole experimentation process was actually quite mana-intensive. After only about 20 spells, Sylphie found herself completely empty. It turns out just one was the equivalent of casting an advanced spell. That may just be a drop in the bucket of mana that Rudy has, but for someone like Sylphie who has more mana than most, even she couldn't keep up with these summoning experiments, once again showcasing just how much more mana Rudy has over everyone. Rudy wasn't sure why it is summoning costed so much more than offensive magic, but he figured since it was akin to a powerful spell you'd only cast once, a higher cost was understandable. It would be a bit OP to be able to spam summons and create your own army of them. I mean, if you've read Solo Leveling, then you'd know what I'm talking about. The thing about these experiments that didn't make sense was the fact that even though a summoning would produce nothing, the same amount of mana would be drained as if it had produced something. It was an adverse side effect Rudy attributed to trying to summon things from a different world. Now, it was after Rudy's job was done that he would usually walk back home with Sylphie. It was on this specific instance of doing so that Sylphie would say it was okay to walk between the girls' dorms again. This, of course, being the path Rudy was on while being accused of thievery. He'd been avoiding it ever since, but apparently with the help of Linnea and Prasenna, his image had shifted from that of a pervert to one of a gentleman. Supposedly the two had spread the message that he was a nice guy, a fair boss who would never hurt the weak. So, with that changing the girls' opinions on him for the better, many would start to look up to Rudy with admiration. Sure, his clothing was a bit shabby and face sometimes gloomy, but the fact he didn't abuse his power was admirable. Rudy would then go and eat dinner, and after that was figure-making lessons with Julie. Each were given their own little project to work on, but Rudy's was now a 1/8 scale figure of Fitz. He couldn't proceed any further than this though, because in addition to Fitz's clothing always blocking his body shape, Rudy also wasn't sure what to put for his private parts, naturally leading Xanaba to offer to sneak up behind Fitz and rip his clothes off. It was before Rudy would go to bed that he would take a bit of time to read the book that Nanahoshi had given him, a story that went by the name of Sig's Summoning. Sig was a witch who often summoned powerful fiends, but after offering more mana than she should have, she ended up summoning a beast that she couldn't control anymore, resulting in her death by getting eaten by it. So, this wasn't particularly useful in learning about summoning itself, but it does teach the important lesson of summoning within your limits. Like, if Rudy was to summon the strongest creature his mana would allow him to, it's very likely it would just end up killing him. In any case, this would be a day in the life of Rudy, bringing us now to the next day where he would get to meet Soldat. The reason he was even in town to begin with was because him and every other party within the Thunderbolt clan were summoned to the city to fight the Demon King. The request had already been cancelled by the time they got here, but since every party was already present, the leader of Thunderbolt decided to have their mandatory yearly meeting early, leading Soldat to take advantage of the opportunity and reach out to Rudy. Now, that conversation— 9 years! That's how long Sylphie has been without Rudy for. It's been 6 since the incident that changed her life, but whether it was 6 or 9, every day of them was spent working towards seeing him again. Unlike how Rudy was able to reunite with the people he loved though, Sylphie was all on her own for all of it. She was left by herself in a place unfamiliar to her, forced to carry the identity of a person that she wasn't. So, it was when Rudy had returned to her life that you could only imagine just how excited she was to see him. Every night she would dream of the life that she envisioned for them, yet it was never something she could act on since she was too scared that he might not remember her. Well, after 9 long years of waiting, all that fear and all that anxiety could finally turn to relief and joy as the two would formally reunite with each other. And it's the build-up of that, along with Rudy's and Sylphie's thoughts of it, that we're gonna look at here in today's cut content. Episode 35, To You, covering chapters 9 and 10 from volume 9 of the light novel. Rudy couldn't figure out what it was that set him off in the library, but it turns out the answer to his problem was close by all along. The main issue with a medicine like that though was the method in which he would acquire a prescription to it. You see, had he known that Fitz was a girl 6 months ago, then Rudy felt he would have courted her more aggressively. But since he didn't want a repeat of the whole Eris situation, Rudy knew it was best to not get too physical too early. So, as he resigned himself to accepting Fitz as a man for now, he would look at his own reflection and wonder if it was attractive to her. It was an appearance he still couldn't consider his own, but for the 16 years since he'd come here, he'd pretty much gotten used to it by now. It was definitely better than the one that he had last time. 2 days would pass since his incident in the library, and that's when we would get to the day of his encounter with Luke. Since most of that was pretty much the same though, we'll instead focus on the scene which should have come after. Rudy had just finished up his classes for the day, and it was as he was heading to his daily experiments with Nanahoshi that Fitz would be waiting to accompany him. If you don't remember from last cut content, because Rudy wasn't going to the library as often, Fitz would sometimes go with him to help with the summoning experiments. So, with this being another one of those times, there was a lengthy awkward silence in which no one would say anything. Combine that with the tense look on Fitz's face, and that would be enough for Nanahoshi to step in and ask if the two had a fight or something. Of course, that wasn't the case, but the flustered response Fitz would give definitely made it seem like something was up. Something Nanahoshi made clear not to get her involved in. You see, if there was any single policy with which Nanahoshi stuck to, it was the distance she made sure to keep from any and all conflict. So, knowing just how deep Fitz's ties were to Asuran nobility, Nanahoshi wanted to stay as far away from that as possible, leaving the two to continue their awkward silence for the rest of the experiments. It was as they walked home together that Fitz would pause as if to say something important. The moment Rudy turned to ask what it was though, Fitz would simply disregard it and part ways with him. It was a question Rudy definitely wanted to get an answer to, but because he promised not to cause any trouble, the only thing he could do was accept it and leave things be. It was an unpleasant state of being since neither could confront the other on what had happened, one Rudy knew that he could only take so much of. Luckily for him, Ariel would be working behind the scenes to make things a bit more manageable between them. It's not like she didn't enjoy watching Sylphie squirm the way that she did around him, but the perpetual sadness that came from seeing Rudy spend more time with Silent and less time with her truly was rather painful to watch. So much so that she was willing to set aside her own feelings of jealousy and help Sylphie come to terms with her own. Now, when Ariel came to ask Sylphie her next question, the response Sylphie gave was in direct contrast to the response she gave to that same question from 2 or 3 episodes ago. This wasn't shown in the anime, but back when Sylphie had first started seeing Rudy again, Ariel had proposed this exact same question to her. When she responded saying that all she wanted to do was help the princess though, the smile Ariel showed after was a genuine smile of relief that Sylphie hadn't seen since the three of them had come here. You see, neither Sylphie nor Ariel wanted to let the other go. Sylphie knew exactly what she wanted, but because she was committed to her role as bodyguard, to say that she wanted to be with Rudy would be the same thing as betraying Ariel. Then, despite Ariel knowing that Sylphie was lying, she couldn't help but be happy that her closest friend was willing to stay with her. She would much rather allow Sylphie to lie to herself than go through the pain of giving up one of the people that she was closest with. That is until we got to this episode here. With 6 months having gone with 0 progress, Ariel was no longer willing to let Sylphie lie to herself. She couldn't stand to see her suffer the way that she was anymore. So, as one friend to another, Ariel made it clear that pursuing her own goals wouldn't be a betrayal to her. In fact, if Ariel was to allow herself to hold Sylphie back any longer, she was certain that she would be betraying Sylphie instead. This may not have held true in the Kingdom of Asura, but here in Renoa, where Ariel's title didn't carry as much weight, there was definitely some truth to be found in it. So this would be what Sylphie needed to hear in order to move on from Ariel. An emotional climax between a most unlikely friendship. The whole scene would have been a lot heavier had they covered more of Sylphie's side stories, but I think the anime did just enough to make the most out of it. The only thing I think really needs explaining are the 2 instances of genuine smiles that the princess gave. There was the one when Sylphie lied to her, then yet another when she told the truth. Both equally rare since every other smile is always artificial and calculated, thus reinforcing just how significant such conversations were, as well as how much a manipulative person like Ariel cares for Sylphie. Now, as the 3 of them discussed ways to get Rudy to remember Sylphie, Ariel had actually tried to put herself in Rudy's shoes. She didn't remember the names of all her attendants, but she did remember a few due to the strong memories associated with them, one of which was a maid named Lilia who had actually saved her life from assassins. So, with that being the baseline on how to jog Rudy's memory, Sylphie felt that she still needed a bit more. Reason being that even with the enormous hint of Fitz being this person who could cast familiar spells silently, several factors made such a hint negligible. The first was Rudy's tendency towards self-deprecation, the second his encounters with overwhelmingly powerful individuals, then the third Fitz's association to Ariel. All of these made silent spellcasting not so notable to him. The first two made it seem like silent spellcasting was easier than he thought, then the third was a bodyguard position that made sense for a powerful spellcaster to be in. So with all that working against them, Sylphie knew that she would have to target Rudy's strongest memory of her, the bullying or the undressing one. Since the bullying one would entail having Rudy save Sylphie from hired thugs, the level of skill needed for those thugs to even stand a chance would have to be adventurer level. The thing is, if they were to go around hiring adventurers, the odds of them finding a group that didn't know Quagmire was, well, slim. Ariel didn't know how far Rudy's network with them extended, but she was certain that they reached much farther than she herself could anticipate. I mean, just this past week they received word that Rudy was drinking with one of the leaders of Thunderbolt. With that being one of the few groups that she trusted to do the job properly, to try any others would just be dangerous. So that left only the undressing story. Now, I'm sure we were all surprised by just how far Sylphie's fantasies with Rudy went, but all that was just the horny stuff. The rest, which was left behind in the novels, was mostly what Sylphie envisioned for her daily life with him. I'm not going to recount the entirety of it here, but if you are interested, it's scrolling across the screen now. In any case, it's in the next scene here with Rudy and the others that we were actually given context behind what Rudy was telling Xanaba to do. Right before Sylphie had arrived, Rudy and Xanaba were attempting to sell their figure-making skills to Bodygotti. They wanted to capture Kashirika's likeness by making a figure of her. Body didn't quite see the purpose of it, but after Rudy explained it was to preserve her current appearance, the idea of multiple Kashirikas at different ages slowly became more appealing to him. He began to see where it is Rudy was coming from with this. Of course, Rudy would be long dead by the time Kashirika fully matured, but that would just mean his skills would have to be passed down to future generations. So all in all, it was an offer that spanned several lifetimes, and the only thing Rudy wanted in return was the spread of his good name from time to time. It was a deal that most definitely favored Rudy's side. An interesting thing Sylphie noticed while Rudy was making this deal was the devious smile he carried while doing so. It wasn't often that Sylphie saw Rudy smile, but it was when she did that they would usually turn out like this. Mischievous grins that truly made him look like a villain. If Sylphie was to compare it to another person's smile, the only suitable match would be Darius's, the evil minister who had driven Ariel out to begin with. She never thought much of it back in the castle, but now that she knew that it wasn't a normal person's smile, she figured it was the look of someone who was clever, never once thinking that maybe there was some ill intent behind it. It's when Sylphie pulls Rudy to the side after this that the only things we miss out on are her inner monologues. An initial one laughing at Rudy's self-deprecating nature, then another that gasped in awe at just how knowledgeable he was. The former came from a misunderstanding in which she thought Sylphie was gonna fight the bodyguard, then the latter was the immediate regurgitation of everything he knew about the Forest of Hail. You see, not only did Rudy know exactly what flowers Sylphie was talking about, but he also went on to talk about all the monsters surrounding it. It was a display of knowledge Sylphie could only gawk at. Fast forward to when her operation would be in its second phase, and the two would find themselves traveling north towards Basharant. It was a 3-day journey right to the border of Sharia. To give a bit more context on why Sylphie found herself blushing, the moment she thought of herself buying Rudy, she immediately envisioned Rudy stepping on a stage butt naked at the slave market. She then thought of everything she'd do to him after, which to her was a potentially fun situation to stumble into. In any case, it's once the two would enter the Forest of Hail that we would find out exactly why it was called such. No one knew why it happened, but they assumed it was a magic abnormality that caused hail to fall on the regular. As for where they were going in this Forest of Hail, the flowers they sought tended to bloom on a cliff on the other side of the forest, a lengthy path which would have them traverse deep snow like this. Another thing Sylphie found herself in awe at was Rudy's ability to maintain the perfect level of heat to melt the snow. Not only that, but the heat he was using didn't produce water vapor either, making it so nearby monsters couldn't easily pinpoint their position. So, to Sylphie's amazement, Rudy knew the exact temperature in which he could melt the snow without creating steam. It was an astonishing feat that highlighted his meticulous control over fire magic. Now, when Sylphie asked to hold Rudy's staff, the innuendos both were making were completely intentional. Rudy smirked as he told Sylphie to get a good grip, and Sylphie was just being Sylphie here. The context for why she wanted to hold it, though, did make sense as we find out there was a valid reason for it. The Asuran royalties simply didn't want to give her one. Since she was already proficient in silent casting, they didn't think that a staff was necessary for her, likely as a pretense to save themselves money. But anyway, an important thing to note about this whole setup is the two advanced tier water mages Ariel had hired to make it happen. The signal was passed through one magical ring to another, and that was cue for the magicians waiting outside the forest to make it rain. One thing nobody had accounted for, though, was the ease in which Rudy could overpower such magicians. Had he been holding his staff, then neither Sylphie nor the magicians outside could prevent him from doing so. Since Sylphie was the one holding the staff, the level at which it powered up her water magic was just enough to counter Rudy's efforts to negate this change in weather, thus giving the hired water mages just enough room to maintain control. Now, because Sylphie's jacket was only useful for stopping snow, rain like this was extremely dangerous to her. You see, unlike snow which could just be brushed off, any sort of water would be absorbed immediately. So, should her jacket become drenched in rain, then the water would soak right through and a single gust of wind would freeze her to death. It was a dire situation in which finding shelter was the only option, bringing them to a cave that Sylphie just so happened to know about. With this finally bringing us back to Rudy's perspective, the only thing on his mind now was how his magic didn't work. The sudden downpour definitely wasn't natural, so why was it then that someone was forcing rain on them? It was a thought that led Rudy to think that perhaps Fitz wanted to assassinate him. That or the noble Ariel was competing with was trying to stop them. Either way, something fishy was very clearly happening here. Once the fire was made and clothes hung up, that rule that Rudy had said to Sylphia about elves being naked was nothing more than an excuse he made up to allow Fitz to undress herself. It was when that didn't work, though, that Rudy would start to worry just like how he did in the anime, leading us to the big reveal that we've all been waiting for. It was while all this was happening, though, that Rudy's inner thoughts would be in utter panic. Not only was he trying to commit to the promise of acknowledging Fitz as a guy, but both his body and mouth were acting on their own now. Before he could even realize what was happening, he was already agreeing to undress Fitz, all while actively moving closer to do so. So, for all he knew, this could be some sort of blackmail scam, but no amount of caution was going to stop his hands from doing what they wanted to do. It took all he had already to just stop himself from going further than this. The actions that started to make Rudy remember things was not only the way that he pulled Fitz's pants down, but also the gloves which revealed hands that he knew he recognized. They were hands that carried a scar from a time when Sylphie had burned herself, a scar reminiscent of another key memory with her. Then, when it came to the final reveal of the woman behind the glasses, what Rudy saw underneath was a face more beautiful than even he could have imagined. Before, he already knew that Sylphie would grow up to become a lady killer, but the visage he saw now was even beyond that. It was one that shared the same beauty of Alina Lise's, yet somehow was more approachable and even more endearing. It was everything that Rudy had expected and more. Episode 36, I Want to Tell You, covering chapters 10 and 11 from Volume 9 of the light novel and Chapter 1 from Volume 10. With Sylphie having just made her declaration of love, Rudy's mind raced to comprehend the revelation that was just made apparent to him. At first, he was overwhelmed by happiness, but it was shortly after that he began to think of Eris. He began to wonder if he had ever told her that he loved her. Here, Sylphie was telling him that she loved him, so what if the reason Eris left was because he didn't reciprocate that love? Perhaps not saying it directly was the root cause of all his problems with women. He knew he wasn't quite at that stage with Sarah, but things were definitely different with Sylphie. So, as much as Rudy wanted to take time and think carefully about how he truly felt, he knew hesitating now may lead to Sylphie's departure too. He felt not responding to her love right here and now would just lead to her disappearing like all the others. That's why he responded the way that he did immediately. Now, Rudy was so concerned with not messing things up that by the time he'd laid Sylphie on her back, the problem he'd thought he'd solved had returned again. The two would continue to try for over an hour, but nothing they did could get Rudy going again. It was a devastating turn of events that made Rudy incredibly depressed. So much so that he just felt like crying now. You see, this wasn't the same as those times with the girl from the brothel or that adventurer he'd hit things off with, but was instead a crucial moment with someone he loved. It was a person he truly felt he had a special connection with. So, to not be able to perform at a time like this, Rudy couldn't even turn to face Sylphie. No. Instead, he just sat there trembling, waiting for the moment she would express her disappointment or just straight up leave. Of course, Sylphie, being the saint that she is, immediately shifted the fault to herself. You see, despite being almost as devastated, Sylphie believed that this was all happening because of her body. Since Luke had warned her numerous times before, she truly believed it just wasn't in the Grey Rat bloodline to be attracted to a body like hers, leading Rudy to explain that it wasn't that. This formal apologetic nature that he resorted to was actually an automatic mode he slipped into whenever he wasn't thinking straight. Not knowing it actually created distance between him and the person that he was talking to. Rudy wondered if Eris and Richard felt the same, but for now he was just going to avoid doing so with Sylphie. So a little while would pass before the two would say anything again, but it was once they did that Sylphie would share her story. From where she teleported to how she became Bits, all the way to her job as Guardian and their journey to Renoa, Sylphie explained how it is she ended up here. It was when Rudy suggested that she should have revealed herself earlier that immediately tears would start flowing as she apologized for not doing so. Clearly, Sylphie was in anguish from the fact that she had to hide it for so long. There were definitely times when she wanted to reveal herself, but with her thinking that he'd forgotten her entirely, there was always the risk that he'd go and tell someone the truth about her, especially since he did have connections to the Boreas family. So, despite Sylphie wanting to make herself known, the mere possibility that Rudy could have been an enemy was more than enough to prevent her from doing so. She also kind of liked the way things were between them. It was when a few pretty girls started to enter into his life though that's when things started to change between them. Sylphie became worried that one might just snatch him away from her. Rudy didn't think that that was likely, but it was definitely possible if, say, Nanahoshi magically found him some sort of cure or something. The extreme gratitude he would have felt towards her very well could have turned into something more. Luckily it didn't, as Sylphie's operation would prove successful. Now, an interesting subplot that was going on the entire season was Ariel's efforts to make Rudy her ally and Sylphie's attempts to prevent him from doing so. I'd mentioned it in an earlier cut content, but Sylphie didn't want Rudy joining Ariel simply because she wanted him to be hers alone. She didn't want to have to share Rudy with another woman. So, when Rudy had asked whether she or Ariel had set up this plan, Rudy was relieved to know that it was Ariel who had. To him, it was an act of kindness that made him think perhaps he could ally with her after all. Sure, he definitely didn't want to get mixed up in dangerous power struggles, but if part of that meant helping Sylphie, Rudy was happy to offer whatever support he could. Of course, Sylphie couldn't just outright reject that, so rather than dismiss his offer straight away, she simply told him not to force himself. She said how she'd be happy to have him on her side, but she also warned that getting mixed up in politics wasn't something he would want either. It was the most she could say to sway Rudy's decision right now. Now, the last thing Rudy had said before leaving the cave was a heartfelt thank you from which Sylphie was confused by. She didn't quite understand why Rudy was thanking her, but for Rudy, he was just happy that things were starting to work for him again. So, with that bringing the conversations in the cave to an end, the next 3 days would be spent getting back to the university. It was a lengthy journey in which one of the core topics of conversation was Rudy's story. Sylphie had come to learn about the girl who had abandoned him, and it was the way that she tossed him aside after escorting her all across the demon continent that made Sylphie think if she ever met her, she'd definitely give her a talking to. You see, the way Rudy phrased the story made it seem like Eris left because he wasn't good enough. Of course, we know that to be just Rudy's personal misconception, but that was enough to make Sylphie dislike Eris. That said, Eris's actions were the very reason the two could even be together here. So, at the very least, there was some good to come from it. It was as the two would part ways that Sylphie would contemplate all that had happened so far. She was definitely on cloud 9 knowing that the two were dating now, but she still couldn't get over how Rudy didn't really seem interested in her body. It's a recurring issue that Sylphie is constantly thinking about. They didn't really show it in the anime, but it's actually her main worry throughout most of the final episode. Fast forward to Sylphie's meeting with Ariel, and Luke's interjection would be quite the big deal here. You see, not only was it rare for Luke to defend a man, but he had actually never blatantly opposed the princess before. Sure, he'd occasionally offer his advice, but to straight up dismiss Ariel's opinions and counter with his own was something Sylphie had never seen in the numerous years she'd been working with him. Thus the reason both her and Ariel were quite visibly shocked by it. It was when Luke had returned with the aphrodisiac that his absolute savagery would lead Sylphie to an all-time low in her confidence. After hearing how no Grey Rat would ever be attracted to her body, Sylphie truly believed that she would never be able to seduce Rudy with it. Luckily for her, Luke's solution was something he'd been holding on for some time now. An extremely rare potion he had managed to pick up back in Fatoa. In total, he had bought 5, but with only 2 used and 3 left over, Luke had no problem giving one to Sylphie. As for Ariel's gift, this was a gesture just as generous as Luke's. I know 2 gold may not seem like a lot, but with all the princess's money being reserved for the war fund, this 2 gold was actually all of her own personal allowance. It was everything she could possibly give under the strict limits that she'd set for herself. So, with 2 gold and an aphrodisiac, Sylphie's closest allies had united to fight against Rudy's impotence. Now, I'm sure some of you may be wondering whether anything was cut from the night of, but from the moment Sylphie arrived to the morning after, everything down to the individual words spoken were exactly the same. It's when Rudy wakes up that the setting for his contemplation is made a little bit different. You see, rather than waking up to find that Sylphie wasn't even there, Rudy simply awoke and kept himself facing away from the other side of the bed. He couldn't bring himself to check and see if Sylphie had left or not. He was fairly convinced that she did though, since he was confident the night before was worse than the night he'd spent with Eris. There were several times when he could tell that Sylphie was in discomfort, but the way she just kept urging him forward only went to make him more excited. So, knowing exactly how rough he was last night, Rudy was fully expecting Sylphie to abandon him just like how Eris did. When he turned over to find her eyes meeting his though, that's when Rudy would express his heartfelt gratitude to her. It was the only thing he could do considering everything that she'd done for him. Not only had she cured the problem he'd been carrying for over 3 years now, but she also didn't leave him when it mattered most. So, just in case saying something more might change her mind, Rudy simply said thank you and hugged her tight. Now, that's how things were from Rudy's perspective, but it's in the novels that Sylphie's gives us an interesting contrast with Eris. You see, before when the two were back in the cave, Sylphie didn't understand why Rudy had thanked her. It wasn't until he had thanked her again now that she finally understood why he did. He was thanking her because she'd helped him. Though she didn't realize it before, Sylphie now knew that she'd helped cure his impotence. So, despite knowing that she wasn't equal to him in things like power, magic, and all his other amazing aspects, through all that she'd still managed to support him. Through all his astonishing feats and stunning achievements, Sylphie was finally able to give something back to him for once. It was a dream she'd long been striving for years now. So yes, there may be things that she'd probably never be equal with him in, but that was okay because she knew she could find other ways to support him. It's a stark contrast with Eris, who could only think of one way to support him. Whereas Sylphie is content by helping through other means, Eris won't consider herself fit for him until she truly is his equal. Unless she can help by providing power similar to his own, Eris won't ever accept being with Rudy the way that Sylphie does. That being the case, it's rather interesting to see how 2 different characters react to what's essentially the same problem. Like, they both have to deal with being a partner to someone who's so unbelievably extraordinary, yet the way they go about it is completely different. One's accepted the fact that Rudy's power is unattainable, while the other departs on a path to make herself equal to such. One's content knowing that she can support in other ways, while the other won't be satisfied until she can support in the only way that she knows how. It's a beautiful cross of 2 beautifully written characters. An amazing portrayal of the people closest to Rudy. Now, it's hard to say whether the ending scene was just a lead-in or a full adaptation of Chapter 1 of the next volume, but the important part was Rudy joining Ariel's party. Yes, him marrying Sylphie was important too, but his pledge to Ariel has a lot more repercussions than his engagement to Sylphie does. I don't think we'll be seeing much of that in the next season, but as soon as Zenith saved and the university arc is finished, Ariel returning to Asura is what I think is going to be the next big arc. I'm sure we're on our way to a lot more action and a bit less slice of life. Now, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!